start recording as well. So yeah, I'm just going to take you through some of the updates that we've done to the award assessment process. So the main things now, to speak a little bit more in detail around this, the changes that we've done to the award manager role. Is changes that's been done to ease the workload and kind of reflecting the increased number of staff that we have. We've also introduced a lead report writer role within each assessment team for consistency and clarity in the report writing, and the award delivery has also moved to a cohort model. So now we'll have 2 cohorts per year. And as Gareth was saying before, our team has expanded a lot. So we now have kind of a little award team within the second improvement team. So that is me being the program manager and overseeing the kind of award assessments and developing the award process. And I'm supported by Emily M, who's the award coordinator. And we're also being supported by Naima, who's our program support officer. So if you're getting emails around the assessments, one of these names is the ones that you will see and interact with throughout. And then we have the award manager role. So it's the same as before. All award managers are student staff members, but we have significantly reduced the role itself to be able to support the workload of our colleagues and also enable us to manage the relationships with universities more effectively. But also, as we're moving to a cohort model, we're also going to be taking on assessments at the same time. So that's why we need that role to be a little bit more focused, I would say, rather than smaller. So the award manager's main role now will be the same for you as it has been before. Their role is to support the assessment team. So they will, as usual, handle all of the meetings. So in your pre-meeting, they will be sharing that, taking you through the self-assessment evaluations, meetings, and also come with you on the on-site visit. The difference is that now the award team is holding all of the relationships with the university. So we're doing all of the meetings together. So the award team is doing all of the meetings with universities and all of the admin surrounding the assessments, and we will also be the ones to help you through the report writing phase as well. And then within the assessment team, we have now introduced a lead report assessor role, and we've introduced that for consistency and clarity in the report writing. So this role is responsible for writing the executive summary and outcome rationale that the award manager wrote previously, and will also lead the response from the assessors in the correction and clarification phase. So if you've done an assessment before, you know, the universities will get to have make some comments around the report itself. Mainly it's if we've used the wrong acronym or that sort of thing, or if they have an award in progress, they could ask for clarifications around the conditions. But it's the lead report assessor just makes sure that the response from the assessors come across in the same tone, and so that it's all kind of in the same way. This is currently being piloted, and we will for the next batch be able to update our guidance and stuff on this. Currently we are assigning lead report assessors based on experience, if you've done an assessment before. But if you're interested in this role, please do contact us, and we can have a talk about it. And then come to the cohort model. So to support our kind of accelerated award process, we have moved to a cohort model. It's been quite a small pilot this year, but it's full cohorts from 25-26. So each cohort supports 6 to 8 universities. So in cohort A, we will have hopefully 6 universities, and this will expand to 8 by cohort B. So they're run twice a year. So cohort A will always have a self-assessment submission in September and an on-site visit in November, and cohort B submits in January with a self-assessment submission in January and a March on-site visit. And each cohort has 3 consecutive timelines embedded within it. So there's 2 assessments running each week, basically. And one of the main things, one of the kind of main changes to this is we used to run the award panel twice a year, and we had to try to fit in award timelines around when the panels were. And some of you might remember or have been in assessments where universities had to wait a very long time to actually get in front of the panel. So the award panel now sits at the end of each cohort. So a university shouldn't have to wait longer than about 8 to 10 weeks to get a ratification from when they find out their outcome. Let's see. This does mean that our assessment deadlines are not flexible. So we need to really stick to our timings. We have also started to introduce a deposit scheme to reserve places on the cohorts, just to make sure that universities don't drop out in the very last minute. The updated framework that Gareth mentioned before, we will start assessing that from cohort A 25-26. So that's just that one additional principle of good practice. We are still working on allocations. They're coming very, very shortly. Do bear with us. It's a bit of a puzzle, but we are nearly there. So in the next couple of weeks, you will find out your allocations for next year. And this is just Dan's picture of kind of more of a visual way of seeing how the assessments are running. And yes, not actually able to log into the hub, so I can't show you directly, but we wanted to just remind you that there's an assessor group on the hub. So if you go on Charter, and some of you might be in the program members group, but there's a group under that where we have the assessor group, and this is a space for you. There's resources there, but also there's a space for you to have some peer support and have some discussions and that sort of stuff. We will have an assessor handbook coming out in the next couple of months as well. And we're also working on a library of learning with a lot of resources. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So my very lovely graph of questions. There have been no questions, but are there any questions? And I see some hands being raised. I think Joe, you were first.
Thanks for that, Amanda. Just looking at the new cohort model, I see the maximum number of assessments we can do a year is 16, but that doesn't sound like that's sufficient to meet demand, unless I've misjudged it. But in the sector, it feels like there's a lot of noise from universities wanting to go ahead with the charter awards. So I'm just wondering if that's going to create frustration, and if there is more demand, whether there's any contingency plans to step that up.
I'm happy to jump in here because I was actually just going to talk to that. So I was just going to say that, yes, the current plan is for going to 16 assessments at the moment. What we want to make sure we can do in the next programme year is to really test that model. At the moment, just being completely transparent, we have had some institutions actually drop out who were booked in for the first cohort. And so we're kind of plugging those gaps if we can at the moment, and we're communicating out to institutions so we can measure that appetite, because I think one of the things that I've noticed is that we're perhaps seeing institutions want to book in a year in advance, like 18 months in advance, because in a great way, there's probably a better understanding of the significant undertaking that going for the charter assessment actually is. So I think it's something that we're going to continue to monitor. And if we do see that we've got that demand and we've got waiting lists, we will look at how we can scale that. I think getting that first cohort done so that we can test that model where we've got multiple universities. We've had a couple in this year as we've got some assessments coming up, but it's not really kind of stress testing that model. So I want to see us go and kind of fill that first cohort in 25, 26. The other thing, just being completely transparent, is we've got to also feed in reassessments, because we've got the first pilot universities that will be up for reassessment, and then we'll start seeing that trickle. So we've got that other balance. So I think I'm acutely aware of what that demand could be, and it's just trying to kind of sense check that and gauge that on a regular occasion. I think what we do need is that we need some kind of like trigger points. So that, for example, the impact on you all as the assessors, because with us being in that cohort model, there's a maximum number of assessments that anyone can do. So like one kind of in the first phase and one in the second. So we're just kind of doing that modelling at the moment. But I completely agree. I think if we are seeing that, which is what we want to see, but I guess the programme needs to do its job of supporting institutions so that we can minimise the number of institutions that are getting award in progress. Because we know, however much we are kind of working towards trying to change perceptions about what award in progress means, in my opinion, it's a really positive assessment that, you know, as an assessment team, you are recognising that that institution has got a whole load of best practice, but there are some areas that, you know, they need to improve on. But it also is more time intensive for the assessment team and for us at Student Minds. But yeah, like I say, if we are getting institutions having a deeper understanding of what that undertaking is, that can only be a good thing, so that we're seeing more people just, I want to say sail through, but let's be honest, does anybody sail through the assessment process? That's a little bit naive. Shell, I can see you've got your hand raised. Apologies if anybody else has. I can't see a full view of all the attendees.
No, that's fine. Morning, everybody. Sorry, I'm sitting on another link and I was there at 10 past 10. I did as I was told, Sir Gareth. So Chelsea and I were thinking, really? This can't be happening. But anyway, the question I suppose I was going to ask was, and I think that we've felt some of the frustration from the pilot through in terms of everything that you've just kind of commented on, Francesca. But you know how you put on these brilliant workshops to try and support and help universities understand what is needed. Is there a requirement that they should do that so we can kind of almost manage their expectations, that, you know, it's really important that you attend all of these sessions before you can actually start thinking about booking ahead in terms of getting your assessment in place? Because I think people are starting to understand this is not a tick box exercise. This is a really, really living activity. And I'm just wondering how we can maybe shape the expectations, because many institutions, you know what it's like. You've got vice chancellors who want the university to get the award, and it's just yet another award. And, you know, do we have that in place where basically institutions know they need to do all this prep work before they can actually register and get a date that they would actually be assessed?
I might ask Amanda to jump in here because she's closest with what the requirements are, but I will just acknowledge what you're saying there, that we can see that immense pressure that are on the teams that we're working with, that they're getting that from the VC, and that there is something that we, apologies if I'm answering this back to front, we want to work with award holders more and those who have gone through the process to be able to talk about what that experience was like, because I think sometimes we can say, oh, you need to think about this, this, and this, but actually hearing from somebody in the room who's gone through that process often illustrates it much better, and also can talk about the challenges of how do you get kind of sign off or buy-in from different areas of the institution. But I'll hand to Amanda just on that requirement.
Can I just say, you know, I know UEL has conditions, but we're really proud and we understand that this is work in action. So everyone on the ground, you know, we had no problem with the conditions because actually we were still recognised as doing really great work.
There's incredible work out there. I think
Vice Chancellors may not feel like that.
You guys probably have more experience of direct conversations with them.
Yeah. Yeah, just on that, we've done the award workshops are mandatory now to attend. And we are tracking who is attending what. We're also planning them in so that they will support the cohorts as well, that they will be running at the so who is preparing for cohort A will have a chance to do them, and we're running them twice a year now as well.
So just ask, do we actually have a requirement that say the award has to be headed up by, say, a minimum of pro-vice chancellor or someone like that, rather than, say, a project manager being brought in to try and collate it and put it all together? Because, you know, I get a sense that some people are actually brought in as project managers rather than having real practitioners led by a senior manager who understands, that actually sends the correct message down to all staff of the purpose of it.
I come in on that. The application to join the program and the application for the award both have to be signed off by a member of the exec team. So there does have to be ownership, and there does have to be buy-in at that level. That said, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, controlling what happens within a university, even if you're in the university, is really hard. And I think one of the things that we also need to do, and that we've been talking about, is we need to separately be thinking about how we are getting the message through to leadership teams separately about what the award is and what they should expect for their institutions and what their teams are going to need to do. Because I think one of the things that's happening is we're getting members of universities coming along to the program. They're engaging with it. They're talking to us about it. They're understanding it. They're going back and reporting it to their leadership teams, who are just looking slightly blank and going, well, that can't quite be true. Just go away and do what we've said. So I think there's a need for us to actually be engaging with those leadership teams and helping to persuade them externally that this is what this is, because within institutions it's just not possible. And we have put those mechanisms in place to say you have to attend the award workshops, which is really helping, and that it has to be signed off by a member of the executive team. And that's really improved things. It's made things much better, and we're getting fewer universities coming through. We are hearing, though, not so much from universities coming through the awards, but from just talking to colleagues around the program and when they're engagement with it, of some staff who are just under a bit of pressure to deliver this as if it was a different type of award. So we are trying to work out how we support those people in those universities and how we get messages to leadership teams, working with some other partners in the sector to try and target that.
Can I ask, sorry to hold the question, but can I ask one other question? Mm-hmm. Do you remember when Halfon made the announcement that he did, that every university must, it should be a requirement?
Yeah.
Have we actually ridden the worst of that and managed to kind of put in a different narrative? And who's supporting, what government policy or government department is supporting Student Minds, the University Mental Health Charter, in actually getting the right narrative out? Because I think he really caused a lot of issues and challenges in terms of the narrative and the agenda he was actually playing.
Yeah. No, yeah, you're right. So obviously, we've had a change of government in that time. They have quite a lot of other things that are taking their attention, as you would imagine, in the Department for Education at the moment. They've been supportive of us since they've come in. We've had, very supportive messages. We've had the funding from the Office for Students for all the work that you've just seen, the expansion of the team, the changing of the structure, the library of learning that we're developing, all of that has had starter funding from OFS to get us going. So we have had support from government around that. I'm not saying we've necessarily had the amount we could do with, and with those conversations will be ongoing, I'm sure. But we have got support from there, and there isn't the pressure that that thing about every university must, definitely isn't part of the narrative now in the conversations that we're having. And important also just to reiterate that it was about universities needing to join the program. We did absolutely put our foot down about universities having to go through the award, because we stressed this is a thing universities go through when they're ready. What we need to do is be helping them to get ready. That's the thing to focus on. So we've put our focus there. But yes, so far it's been, we've had supportive conversations and supportive messages from the new government so far. Fran, I don't know if you wanted to come in.
I was just going to say, just touching on what Gareth said about us taking a bit of control over that narrative as well. When having helpfully hindrance, don't want to say my opinion, made that call out, it didn't really give us the opportunity to really control how people were responding to the charter. And now we're in a position that we can do that. So the reports package launched before Christmas was a really good opportunity for us to kind of start doing more of that proactive narrative control, to be able to share all the insights that we've seen, come through all that first batch of assessments, to talk about, be quite humble about where we've had negative feedback or constructive feedback, where we've needed to make improvements, but the plans that we've got going forward, and to be able to have the UCLan external assessment as well. So it's not just kind of what we're thinking. And I think we need more of that. And whether there's time and space to think about that today with you all, or that it's a separate conversation that we pick up after, I think we're really keen to tap into you all as assessors as well, to think how can we work with you all potentially to help us kind of have those champions out there who are banging the kind of same drum as us. And it was really nice. I was in a conference in Scotland 2 weeks ago. Apologies, it's all a blur. But we had Glasgow Caledonian talking about the charter and about the way that they have embedded it into their institution. So, we had one of our team speak, but the people sat up and listened when one of their own spoke. And I think that was really powerful to demonstrate this is actually how you embed the charter. This is how we've used it. It might not be the same way that you want to do it. And this is how we kind of use it as this umbrella for all of these other charters, requirements, regulations, pieces of work. And the charter is their overall kind of plan, but they don't refer to it internally as a charter. And I think we need to be doing that kind of mapping and doing more of that. Then hopefully, continuing to work with the new government and seeing where they land.
Cool. If there are no other questions at the moment, we'll move along. But do keep all those thoughts in your head, and we will come back to them all across the day. And if there's anything else you do want to ask, feel free to put it in the chat or to raise your hand, and we'll, all of this is live stuff that we're thinking about and talking about all of the time. So if you want to add into that, please feel free to do so. So just want to pick up then and just talk a little bit about the Insights report, which was part of that package that was launched in December. First of all, just to, as I said, just to bring back to the update of the framework document, which hopefully everyone's seen, and please do read through it before you do your first assessment. After the second edition won't kind of come into play necessarily until I think it's next year, to give universities time to adjust and adapt to it. But we haven't made that many significant changes, as I said, to the principles of good practice, basically. So what we did is we did an additional literature review, and we looked at everything that's been published since the charter was published in 2019. It was, the first framework was published in December 2019. I don't know if people remember what was going on around about that time, that we were in the middle of a general election. I think the day that we published the framework document, the person who was then our Prime Minister hid in a fridge. And so, lots has happened in the last 5 years. This was pre-COVID. We launched in December 2019. COVID obviously struck in March 2020. So, it's been a lot has happened in the last 5 years. But one of the great things that happens is partly because of the existence of Smartin and Nicola Byram's work and kind of driving all that forward. We've seen a lot of research published in this area over the course of that time. And I think also there's been quite a lot of kind of new guidance and new support for universities that's been published. So we've been able to kind of pull all of that in our thinking of the update of the framework overall. And then we updated the overall thing, and we also updated each kind of theme. So we made sure that each theme was in line with what the evidence is now saying. We have altered text, some of it just a little bit, some of it's about nuance, things that we know slightly better now or understand more now. Some of it's been rewritten a little bit more substantially because there's been quite a bit more work in that. And then that update was submitted to a team of peer reviewers so that all of that was checked, that somebody external had checked all of it to make sure it was still in line with the evidence. That resulted in a few more tweaks and a few more changes. Nothing substantial this time around, I'm pleased to say. But that then led to that kind of publication of that second edition of the framework, so that is now as up to date as it can be. We will update again in future years as well as new evidence emerges and as new things emerge. But we can be confident that as far as the evidence we have right now, that framework is absolutely up to date and is supported by the evidence. So in terms of questions universities might ask, the original framework, thankfully, is still largely supported by what we found. So we didn't feel we needed to change the domains or any of the themes or the general conversation about whole university approach. Most of the principles of good practice, the vast majority of principles of good practice can remain unchanged because the evidence still really supports them. And that's really encouraging. We took a principle-based approach because it built in some of that flexibility. So it was evidence-based, but it wasn't so narrow that we were likely to need to change it constantly. So we still got the same 18 themes, still got the 4 domains and the underpinning themes. That whole structure remains the same and remains really familiar. All of the principles of good practice in the main have stayed the same. There's 1 or 2 tweaks, and there's 1 new principle of good practice, which we'll talk about in a moment. So there's no dramatic need for any universities who are already working on the award to change direction. If they engage with the second edition of the framework, it'll just give them more up-to-date evidence. It'll just point them towards more of the up-to-date guidance. So it should just support them a bit more rather than throwing them or make them think they've got more work to do. The number of references has massively increased, and that's just because of the amount of new work that's been published. So there's a lot of reading done in the summer. As I said, the text has been rewritten to kind of reflect all of that and to bring greater clarity. There were a few places actually where universities had kind of queried with us, what does this mean, this or this, exactly what does that mean? So where that was the case, we've also tweaked that to make it clearer what we meant. And as I said, we've highlighted those new guidance and resources. The one change we've particularly made to the principles of good practice, we've introduced 1 new principle in theme 1 in transition into university. So that now reads, universities monitor and seek to adapt their own practice, culture and structures to remove barriers to successful transition and to ensure the university environment is fully accessible to the whole student community. What this principle is particularly focusing on is the idea of, rather than us trying to adapt students to fit the university they're coming to, we actually think about adapting what we do to meet the students we actually have rather than the ones that we want. Because I still get a sense sometimes when I'm out in the sector, and particularly when I'm talking to university leaders, that they're still waiting for things to go back to normal and for them to get the student cohort that they used to have 25 years ago. And that no one really wants to change what they're doing. And there's still a lot of, how do we get students ready for what we want to do? And that goes all the way down into academic programs and into curriculum about, students should be able to do this by the time they arrive with us. So how do we make sure they do that without us having to change what we're teaching, rather than, well, this is what our students are able to do when they arrive with us. So how do we adapt what we do to that to then guide them to where they need to be? So it's that push really onto universities to say, well, what are you thinking about in terms of adapting what you do to make sure that actually you're accessible for the students you're getting? So that's the kind of the drive of that. There was a kind of hint of that in the text of the original framework, so it's not out of the blue, but we just have more work in that space now to say that this is a place where we should be pushing universities a little bit more. That principles of good practice won't come in until next year. So the universities who are being assessed this year will not be being assessed against that principle of good practice, but those who are in the cohorts next year will be. So I'll just pause there just in case. Does anybody have any questions about the update to the framework document? Is there anything else anybody wants to just check on before we talk about the insights report? Not seeing any hands. We can come back to it at any point later on if you want to as well. Okay, so the insights report overall. So what we've always wanted to do through this is that we've always been really aware that the data that we're gathering, the evidence that we're gathering through the award process is really rich. There's a lot in here, and there's a lot in it that's really important, but that's not being reported anywhere else. It's not being talked about anywhere else within the sector, or if it is, it's in kind of informal conversations. There are kind of things that people on the ground sort of know, but that's actually not being formally reported everywhere, and therefore it means that not everyone knows about it more generally in terms of decision making. So what we did is we analyzed 24 of the outcome reports. So we excluded from this things like the pilot reports and things like that, the early ones where we were still working out what we were doing. So we focused on the ones from when we, in 2022, when we knew what we were doing, we had got consistency in the reports, and we've looked at the 24 outcome reports that we did since then. We did a kind of a narrative analysis of all of the excellent and good practice, every recommendation, and every risk that was identified. And we coded all of that thematically. We compiled it by framework theme. And then we did a kind of a second level analysis overall to kind of identify commonalities generally across universities. And then we kind of pulled all of that together to try and identify, well, what are the common themes that we're seeing? And out of all of that then, because there were so many universities that had awards in progress, we also then went and looked at the panel feedback to universities once they actually got the award, when they were kind of there's the process that people have to go through, where they go through, they get their award and process, then they have to resubmit, and then the assessor team gives feedback, the panel gives feedback. We included all of that as well because we wanted to look at, well, what happens post somebody getting an award in progress? What changes does the feedback and the guidance that goes back to universities alter after that, and are there lessons we can learn from all of that too? And then all of that got pulled together and synthesized to produce the overall report. So our first thing to say to all of you really is thank you, because you are helping to produce this evidence base, and the work that you're doing, the detail that you go into in the reports, the consistency with which you're trying to deliver all of that, and the insights that you bring, the expertise that you bring, has been really helpful and really powerful. I'll talk a little bit about ways in which we might improve that in future, but what you've done so far has been incredibly helpful. And it is really clear that that universities are getting, in that award report that goes back to universities, it's an incredibly valuable resource. And if they were paying for consultants to come in and do that level and quality of work, they'd be paying a huge amount more. So thank you for all of that, because you really are helping those universities to kind of embed and improve their whole university approach. So as I said, there's a real rich set of evidence there from which we can learn. It's also really clear from what, as we've been reading through this, the other thing to thank you all for is that as time has gone on, the quality and consistency of our reports has continued to improve. So definitely the 2022 reports were better than the ones we were doing at the very, very beginning, but that consistency, that quality and that consistency has continued to improve as we've got better and as you've got better at what you were doing. So that's been really helpful. As that gets better, as it gets more consistent, as it gets clearer, it's also much easier for us to analyze and to draw out those lessons. And so we get a much clearer evidence base about what's happening in universities and what the common challenges are that people are facing. So our key lessons at that kind of top level, what is it that you were finding? What is it that you were working, that you were drawing out? First of all, whole university approach is a challenge. That's not a surprise to any of us. And no one was doing a whole university approach perfectly across all 18 of the themes. So basically in every report, there was a theme or two, even for those that did really well, where the assessors were saying, actually, this isn't quite a whole university. It's a bit siloed. It's a bit isolated in the way that this has been developed. There are actually, for some of your universities who are going through the award, so this will definitely be true for universities who haven't yet, there's still work to do in helping universities really understand what a whole university actually means. Some universities are just thinking it means you've got to have activity in each of those areas, rather than thinking about how everything connects together and how everything is then embedded and becomes habitual within the university. What we've started to do now in everything that we do is we've selected Sally Kift and Karen Nelson's model of kind of the generational change that happens within universities to talk about what whole university means and the process that universities go through to bring about that change. I'll talk about that in a little moment, but if you read the framework and the insights report and the award handbook, and you see the webinars that we're delivering to universities, you'll see that we are consistently using that same model to talk to universities about what whole university actually means, so that they're getting a consistent message. And that is getting through to universities in terms of what it is that they actually need to do and what they need to be working on. So that model seems to be something that people are finding helpful. There were three kind of recurring issues that we saw over and over again in theme after theme. I'm not quite sure why my numbering's got a bit odd, but we saw this in theme after theme after theme, which was about consistency, about governance, and about evaluation. And this occurred in every report, and it occurred across multiple different themes in most of those reports. So these are three big things that, again, we're going to be going out and talking to universities about much more in the next few years. So if we break those down, in terms of consistency, we saw lots of inconsistencies in lots of places. So, and I'm sure all of this will absolutely echo with you. So we saw inconsistencies between policy and practice, where we'd be arriving on an on-site visit with the policy saying one thing and then staff on the ground telling us they were doing something different, or where there were clashes of policies, where one policy said one thing, one policy said another. We were seeing inconsistencies sometimes between what universities were doing and actually what national guidance and regulation and evidence was telling us elsewhere. Students and staff would very much report to us about inconsistencies between departments and teams. Sometimes this might be within one department, so you might get different teams within student services in behaving in different ways, different academic teams behaving differently. So that inconsistency came out a lot. Another thing that came out quite a lot was the different experiences students are having in different spaces in their university. So particularly for universities who had multiple campuses, quite often one of the things that was being highlighted was that there was a gap for one of those campuses that was less thought about, where there were more problems, where maybe services weren't as accessible, those kinds of things. And also differences in experience within different accommodation. So different halls of residence, depending on where it was located. Sometimes it was to do with location, sometimes it was to do about the age of the building or how much support was available. So real inconsistencies there. And then within staff teams as well, also reporting inconsistencies between how supported they felt, or how much autonomy they felt that they have, or how well they felt their well-being was being looked after, between kind of academic staff, professional staff, and other colleagues. And interestingly, in some of those reports, particularly highlighting, I think, if I think about one of the assessments that I did, where actually what came out really clearly was a university who had really thought carefully about how it was communicating to its staff around well-being and doing that on a regular basis, but trusting most of it to email and Teams, and forgetting that there's a chunk of their staff who don't have computers. So that kind of inconsistency was being highlighted as well. And then finally, of course, that different staff groups and different student groups having different experiences, sometimes by demographics, sometimes this is an inclusivity issue. But again, seeing that some students and staff feel a greater sense of belonging, more looked after, more cared about, more seen, more visible than others. This isn't probably a surprise. Universities are complex things. We know that people exist in bubbles within their institutions. But in some cases, these inconsistencies were actual problems. There were things that the universities really did need to address. It's unlikely we'll ever get to a point where everything is consistent, and we don't want every bit of every university doing things the same, because again, we also want people to be thinking about their context. What's right for art students is not going to be what's right for business students. But it's about that consistency of experience and consistency of overall thought and principle that really matters. So the second thing is governance, and that really split into two areas. One which was, I've just seen someone's posted in the chat. Oh, okay, Ella, yeah, no problem. Service governance. So service governance particularly, and this is the area where we've had most of our awards in progress. Not every award in progress has been about this, but most of them have been, which was about whether universities were able to demonstrate that their services were safe and effective, whether information sharing was appropriate, whether they had the right staffing in the right place. Sometimes we were seeing universities with unqualified staff doing work that really should have been left to qualified staff, where management of risk was not being properly overseen. Sometimes where there were problems with resources, and sometimes where services where there were problems with accessibility. So right across the principles of good practice in that support domain, where there was that overall lack of governance. We are now going to be doing much more work in trying to help universities understand what that means in terms of service governance, overall that clinical governance that needs to be in place. We have, for our new library of learning, we've produced a webinar that specifically focuses on this. We talk about it much more in the online webinars that universities have to do, and we're going to be going out and trying to target some of the kind of the conferences and spaces around the sector where particularly student services colleagues are going to be, so that we can get that message across them and have that conversation. What's been also really helpful for this, and I'll come to you in a moment, Michelle, is that we also have some colleagues who have gone through the award process, who have gone through the development of governance themselves through the award process, who have also provided us with resources and with videos talking about what they did and how they approached it and what they've learned, which I think, again, going back to Fran's point, is also really helpful, because what that then means is people are also going to be hearing from colleagues and from peers rather than just from us. Shell, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, it was just really about the management of risk. I think, you know, every assessment I've done, that risk element has probably been one of the weakest within institutions. And I'm just wondering, I mean, you know, transitions, progressions, the sessions that I kind of ordinarily look, I'm an expert in, are great. But actually, when it comes to the risk element, there's kind of like a real, sometimes it feels a lack of understanding of how universities understand what risk is and what they need to do. So what is the new structure doing to kind of really explain to them about the risk element?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're trying to target a little bit more. And I think some of this is about what we're doing on the program, as I said, and some of it's going to be about the messages that we're trying to carry out. And then, as I said, the resources that we're putting into the Library of Learning. I think there are two elements to this, really. One is about universities understanding the kind of risk that comes from not thinking about your safety and effectiveness of your services. So the fact that actually your services, if you're not properly evaluating and engaging with that can create risk in itself, that the interventions that you're providing might actually do harm. So there's a real gap in understanding around all of that. And we can see that really clearly now. We've done enough of these reports. We've done the analysis of the reports. We can see quite clearly that there's a gap in understanding there. And we're going to be targeting, you know, we're going to work with Amoshi, for instance, to try and target some messaging out through that and to kind of go to Amoshi conferences and things to get those messages across much more. The second thing about the management of risk overall, that this is one of the other areas where we have had some awards in progress. And so where we've seen gaps where, for instance, university plans, well, might not have had plans around risk, but where they might be missing a whole section. So where there's nothing around postvention, for instance, if I think about one of the recent awards in progress that we've had with the university, and they said, oh, well, we've got a student death policy, but you look at it and there's nothing in it about postvention because they haven't really engaged and understood what that means. So again, it's one of those areas where we'll use the Library of Learning to try and target all of that. And then we'll think about how we use our in-person programs and again, what messages we need to get out to deliver. I think one of the things is having come through the last 5 years and getting to this point with the charter overall, we have a much clearer idea now about what the messages are that we actually need to get out into the sector. So we're thinking now much more about not just about what we're doing when people are coming to us, but also where do we need to go? Where do we need to be with what messages? So I'm thinking about those conferences where student services colleagues go to, where leaders go to get those messages to them in their places rather than just expecting them to come to us to kind of tackle all of that. So that's kind of what the work we're doing to kind of think about all of that. But hopefully taking people through the webinars as a mandatory thing will also help with all of that as well. The other element of governance that I think is really important is about the university level governance as well, which is that we can clearly see those universities that do really well actually have got really good governance in place to oversee their whole university approach. They've got a really good working committee. It's not just dumped on one person. They've got a group that's bringing together departments from across the institution. That's actually also plugged into kind of the decision-making and deliberative structures within the university. It's linked to someone senior, to go back to your point earlier on, Shell, so that there's someone senior with an overview of all of this who has responsibility for that, and where there are clear processes and training in place to help with all of that. The other gap that we see sometimes is where actually you've got good service governance, but it's not in any way connected to university governance. And actually university leaders might not even know that that governance exists or is needed. And so at an institutional level, they're actually carrying a bit of risk because they're unaware that there's governance that's needed and is in place. So no one senior's checking on it. No one's making sure that it is what it needs to be because they don't even know it's there and it's needed. So how do we plug together that university level governance to the service governance to make sure that those two things are connected together? And then the final kind of those three things, which is evaluation. This is a challenge for the whole sector. This again won't come up as a surprise overall. We need to help the sector develop more pragmatic, realistic methods of evaluating interventions, those services, those activities, because we can't be running randomized control trials and everything. That's going to create more work than delivering the intervention takes. And universities just don't have the resource to do that. And also, I'm not convinced it would be the right thing, even if we could. So we need to be working on that. And that's an ongoing conversation that we're having with, for instance, Nicola Byram at Smart and people like Alison Dodd, to think about how do we help universities work out how to evaluate. It's easy with things like counselling services, we kind of know and understand that. But how do you evaluate your more proactive interventions? How do you, your whole university approach? How do you know that that's working? Those things are much more difficult. Ava, you've got your hand raised.
Thank you. Yeah, just sort of, working in the university sort of sector, delivering, I guess, mental health support and services to students. We do struggle with what outcome measures to use for the student population, because what I find is sort of from my previous life in public health, those outcome measures often don't really apply to the student population, because you have a lot higher level of functioning, and so you don't really measure what is happening sort of for your episode of care. And then the sort of more well-being focused measures, we find they often don't capture your spikes. So, sort of the students that are sort of more outliers. And I'm wondering if there is any sort of sharing of knowledge, that is happening. Because when I talk to colleagues within the higher education sector, it seems that we all sort of struggle with which clinical outcome measures to use.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There isn't one that's ideal for this population. So we need to be aware of the fact that there isn't one that's perfect. So we are working with, but then I also would say, I don't think there's one that's ideal for measuring mental health anyway. They're all kind of compromises in some ways anyhow. All of them have some kind of drawback to them. So we're always working in a slightly compromised position with them. And I think therefore we should always be interpreting them in that way. I think the outcome measurements are at their strongest when we use them with nuance and interpretation and are aware of their weaknesses. I would say that in terms of things like counselling, it's worth saying that CORE was actually developed in universities tested with student populations. CORE actually did at one point try to develop a specific student measure, but they stopped their work because the correlation between the student measure and their normal measure was just so high that there was no point. So CORE isn't bad.
Sorry.
CORE is it's an outcome measurement, CORE.
Yeah, but they've got different. They've got the CORE 10, GP CORE.
So the other thing is that they were using CORE 34 at that point.
Okay.
So they were correlating it to CORE 34. But the other interesting thing is CORE 10 and CORE 34 correlate to about 0.95. So you can get very similar out measurements with just 10 questions rather than 34.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I guess what we found with the CORE, though, it's a measure of psychological distress.
Yes.
So it's very narrow.
So it really is only appropriate for services like counselling or mental health teams. It's less appropriate for if you want to, if you've got a universal intervention that you want to evaluate, it's much less. What I would point you towards, though, is Alison Dodd led some work trying to identify what are the most useful measurements for this population. So if you look at Alison is ALYSONDODD, I think she's at Cumbria. If you look up her paper on that, and I think it might be in the references in the charter framework document, actually. If you look up her work on that, she lists those measures that she did some evaluation work on it. She had a team that did some evaluation work to see which ones were probably most helpful. That'll probably give you a set to think about. But there isn't one that's perfect. The other thing that's happening is, really excitingly, as a result of some of the work that came out of the Charter Award, the team at UWE are actually trying at the moment to work out how to develop something that is more specific to the student population. So there is work ongoing within UWE to try and do all of that. So again, it's another way in which the Charter Award's having an effect, in that the universities gone through it have gone away thinking, actually, we could do with something that's better and that's more bespoke, and they're doing the work to try and do all of that. But obviously, it takes quite a while to do that piece of work.
Thank you.
Was there someone else's hand who just went up there? It came and then it went. Yeah,
Sorry.
go.
Just very, very quickly. Gareth's aware of this, but if this can just be please on this call, Chatham House Rules, I do something called a pre-arrival academic questionnaire, and it's evolved over the years to kind of really help understand prior learning experiences, concerns on entry, expectations on outcome. We have Advance HE, Jessica and myself have received funding to do a national pilot this September. And so what I very much am highlighting is that all the questions as you go through map to the themes in the student university mental health charter. And so hopefully, you know, by weaving this in and linking pragmatic activities to it through through the University Mental Health Charter, hopefully we'll get quite good engagement. It's a 2-year project. We can do it undergrad and at postgraduate level. As I said, more information, Gareth is aware of it, and what we're having is an advisory group and a working group, and the working group will consist of experts like Liz Thomas, like Paul Wakeling, real practitioners to help shape questions that are really pragmatic and help and support, and it's about making sure that we have those good mental health questions that start to educate universities which may be flags that actually can highlight the next step. So just to say that that is work in action, and it is very much mapped to the University Mental Health Charter themes.
Thank you for that, Shell. And it's an exciting piece of work. If any of you haven't read Shell's original report using the pre-arrival questionnaire, it is definitely worth a read. And again, it speaks to that point, the new principle of good practice that we've put in about universities adapting themselves to the students who they have. You know, the pre-arrival questionnaire is a good way for universities to actually work out who's the student population that's coming in advance of them coming. And there's some quite surprising findings in that report about experiences that students have or have not had that we might otherwise have made assumptions about. So taking us back to here, we also still have work to do to help some colleagues understand why this is necessary. And as I say about the risk of harm by well-intentioned actions, there's still work to do to help people understand that, you know, you may be doing something with the best of intentions, with the best of interest. It can still do harm if we're not evaluating it properly. So just some other issues that emerge as we kind of run up to some final questions in the break. Social inclusion and belonging, we're going to talk about more later on today. It's clearly an area of difficulty. We can see that it's been impacted on by the pandemic, by the cost of living crisis, by social media, that the ways in which friend finding is happening and social interactions happening on campus particularly has changed, and that's causing some problems in terms of students' sense of belonging. We're seeing loneliness increasing. It's really underexplored in the research literature. There's a lot we don't understand here. So we're going to come back and talk about that a little bit more today. In terms of what universities are doing, though, a lot of what we're seeing is kind of the thinking about social inclusion, belonging kind of sits outside the classroom. It's kind of thought about as it's what student union do, as what one university said to us when we were talking to them about it. Or it's seen very much as an extracurricular piece. There are university level things. There might be a student life program going on, but it's all disconnected from curriculum. It's kind of piecemeal. There isn't a whole university approach or whole university thinking about how to help students find that self of belonging and that sense of inclusion. There are some concerns around information sharing, and this is one of the areas we want to go away and try and support more work across the sector to do, because although there's been a lot written about this and there's been a lot of national guidance issued, some of it contradicting each other, it's clear that there's still real variation in practice, and people have come to different conclusions from the same guidance and the same legal outcomes in terms of when we should and when we shouldn't share information, and what the process is for making that decision, what support you have in place for making that decision. So it's clear that actually different legal teams are taking different approaches to this and understanding different things, so which means there's an ongoing lack of clarity for colleagues in the sector as a whole, which is why you then get these variations in practice. So we're picking this up as a kind of more of a national issue that we're going to want to push forward on to really try and get to a clear understanding around all of this that's helpful for everyone. It could well be that some of that sector guidance isn't actually correct, given some of what we're hearing from some legal teams. It may be that some bit is slightly misleading. I don't know that, but it's a possibility, and it's definitely something we need to be exploring more. And one of the things I would say is that if we are finding problems around information sharing, or if we're concerned about a university's approach, that we probably should, in our recommendations, be directing university colleagues back to their legal teams and their data protection teams to clearly make decisions about this. We need to be careful about offering advice on this because it's such a murky area with so much complication. We need to be careful that we're not seen to be offering legal advice when we're not in a position to do so. So if we're concerned, we highlight why we're concerned and then say, you should go back to your legal team and your data protection teams and have conversations about these issues and come to a conclusion. In terms of external partnerships, there were some real significant differences here, and a lot of it's to do with the circumstance that the university itself is in. So we find that there's some real excellent practice in this area, but what's quite interesting is the excellent practice tended to be for universities who are in kind of in cities or close by each other, where there are at least 2 large universities with a lot of power and influence who are able to then work with the local trusts to create these kind of working groups and shared practice together. So you can see this in places like Manchester or Bristol, for example, would be obvious examples. It's much harder if you're a small independent university, small specialist of like a few hundred students, to actually get the NHS to engage in the same way. Or if you're in London, the London universities are definitely finding this harder. So there's a pattern here that suggests that what works in some places is clearly not going to work in other places, and we need to have that in mind when we're evaluating all of this. And it doesn't appear to be from lack of effort and desire. Lots of those universities who were struggling to get engagement could point to lots of things they were trying to do, but not necessarily working. That isn't to say that that was always the case. There were some cases where we were able to give there was some good guidance in those reports to universities about how they could approach what they're doing differently, and work that they maybe needed to do to try and engage in a different way with local NHS or social care or third sector. But there's clearly something going on that is about where you are and what type of university you are and what else you've got nearby that really impacts on how easy it is to create those external partnerships. And then staff well-being, I do want to just highlight, because I'm sure you are all very aware, it is a challenge. And that comes out in more or less all of the reports. That said, it is not inevitable that staff well-being is horrendous, because we are very clearly seeing that in some universities, it is actually not bad. It's not perfect because the sector is not in a perfect place, and it's hard for it to be in a really good. But some universities were managing this challenge much better than others, and were placing staff well-being at the heart of the decisions that they were making in response to the challenges they were facing. Whereas at others, that was clearly not the case. It's really clear that as a sector, we can't go on like this, because we're now, I think, reaching a point where this is becoming unsustainable. And the research around staff well-being that we've referenced in the framework document, which kind of supports what we were seeing in our visits, kind of indicating in some places that university staff are experiencing higher levels of workplace stress than those in blue light services. And there's no good reason for that to be the case. So staff well-being, again, is one of those things we're going to continue to talk about more in our external work, and to push on this idea that it's inevitable, because we did hear from some universities, well, of course, staff well-being is poor. It's inevitable given the state of the sector, which kind of then becomes an excuse for actually not prioritizing it. Whereas we are seeing some universities prioritizing it and not having to respond in that way, and not having to lean on staff in quite to that extent. So we need to be challenging that narrative back to say, not everywhere, actually, and not everyone. And it is possible to think more about staff well-being and to do more. So just some other things kind of coming out of all of this. In terms of service governance, we've started talking about service governance, kind of helping break down what that actually means a little bit more. So we're talking about the organization. So this is what exists prior to any student coming through the door, really. So what's the structure, what resources in place, what staff have you got in place, what qualifications and experience do they have, what's your reporting lines through all of this, what's the overall governance that's in place, how has the decision about this structure been made. Then there's the actual operation. So how are things actually done in real life? Because very often there's a variation between what the plan was and what people actually do. How do you actually manage risk when it comes in? How do you make decisions about sharing that information? What's the culture of the team? Are people able to challenge each other? All of those kinds of things. And how are things referred out? Then the outcome. Is the outcome actually evaluated in some way? Can we demonstrate that it's safe and effective? Are we listening to the voices of those people who are using those services overall and what they're telling us about that? And are we looking at that kind of broader data sets that we've got to see if there's anything else, like, is there a population that we're not reaching for some reason? And then are we using all of that to actually improve overall, or are we just gathering the data and letting it sit and going on with doing what we've always done? And helping universities to see this as an ongoing kind of process between these kind of 4 O's, that organization, operation, outcomes, and ongoing improvement. Again, just trying to break down what we mean by governance, because I think some of our colleagues who maybe haven't got experience, haven't come up to become student services managers through health services or with a professional background, that kind of governance word just feels a bit amorphous and a bit frightening. So trying to break down what this actually means, that it's not scary, it's just a really pragmatic, sensible way of thinking about how you provide these kinds of services, making sure that they're safe, making sure that they're effective, making sure they're accessible, and that you're learning from what you're doing to lead to that constant ongoing improvement. And again, this is a message that we will be taking out to universities to help them understand that this is what we're thinking about when we're talking about governance. But let's finish with some absolute good news, because one of the other things is that there are some amazing work going on out there. I mean, some of the examples of excellent practice are astonishingly good. And, you know, we should really be celebrating a lot of that, about the effort that universities are putting into this, the effort that a lot of our colleagues are putting in, and how much people in universities do genuinely care about their students and about their mental health and well-being, and how much some universities do care about their staff and about their well-being as well. Also really clear from the reports the impact that the framework and the award process have had. There's a lot of new work that gets created in universities when they start to work on the award, when they start to think about where are we, what are our gaps, what do we need to do? And that's leading to better whole university work, new interventions, improvements being made. And so actually, you know, for us, one of the most exciting and most important things, the fact that actually what you're seeing are colleagues having conversations with each other that otherwise wouldn't have happened. People sitting down in rooms together to have those conversations and realizing that there are maybe some quick wins that they've got, or that there are things they can work on together to actually improve things and take on kind of shared challenges. And actually, in some cases, when we did that analysis of what happens after somebody gets an award in progress, we've actually seen those areas where there was an award in progress move not just to being acceptable, but actually to being excellent practice, which is really exciting when you see that, when you see a university, you know, take that journey through where they've really engaged with the feedback, all of that feedback that you've given them, really engaged with it, really thought about it. And what comes out at the other end then is way better than they ever would have done had they not come through the award process. So thank you again to you for all of that, because the whole reason this whole thing exists, the whole reason the charter exists, is to try and improve what's happening in universities, to try and improve the mental health and well-being of our staff and our students in universities. And we can see you are genuinely contributing to that from the work that you're doing. So thank you very much for all that. And you should feel really positive about the effect we're having overall, even though there are definitely things we need to work on. I'll pick up the questions in a moment. I just want to finish off just a little section, then we'll come to more questions. How we're going to use it. This all gives us far more evidence for campaign work and for us to get some funding in key areas. That might not necessarily be funding for us. It might be about funding for research in some of those key areas. And we've been having conversations with Smartin about, you know, where we can look for funding and who might be good to do some of the research in this area where we've got gaps. It is absolutely inputting into the charter program. We will use this to think about what we need to provide, what materials we develop, and what we need to cover in the program overall. And it's going to inform, in fact, the Library of Learning. The idea of the Library of Learning springs out of the analysis we've done from this Insights reports, as it started to become clear that there were real common things we needed to be talking about, and we needed to be doing more to help educate colleagues. The idea from the Library of Learning came from all of that. So what we're going to do with the Library of Learning is we're going to grow it organically over time. It will be a static resource. And initially on there, it's going to be broken down by domain. And so you can go into each domain. There'll be an introductory webinar talking about the domain and the key things to think about within it. There'll be links to the Insights report and the charter framework for each domain. And then we'll also be providing in there resources from those universities who have already got the award about, you know, what they have done within that domain. We'll also be linking to research. So we've got researchers doing videos summarizing some of the research that they've done in that area in a bite-sized, easily accessible way. And we'll also be creating some kind of in-conversation recordings where I'll be talking to somebody who's a kind of a researcher in this area to really try and understand some of the key challenges around all of this, to really tease out the nuance. So that'll be kind of a longer piece of work. And then we'll also be linking out to national guidance and to other opportunities for further training and so on. over time, what we'll do is that we'll then structure it actually by theme as it gets bigger and we've got enough resource, and that it will have a kind of pedagogical structure to it, so that you could almost use it as a static resource to educate yourself from not really knowing anything about the subject to actually being quite well informed by the time you've worked through all of it, so that there's a big resource that we can point people towards, either individual parts of it or the whole absolute thing. So again, there's more resource there and more available to guide universities in what they need to do. And if you are researching and publishing in university mental health, and you're finding the insights report useful, please cite it, because that makes it visible. And we know that the more visible these things are in research, actually the more serious they get taken as well. So that would be really helpful to us as well. So we're going to continue collecting all of that, and we're going to continue doing some analysis on all of that. What we're thinking of doing at our next analysis is, rather than doing the same structure of the report, that actually what we might do is home in on 2 or 3 areas where there seem to be a kind of a more of a challenge, and do an in-depth analysis. So maybe around something like social inclusion and belonging, and do a more in-depth report focusing on 1 or 2 themes, because we think that might be more useful to really target the more challenging areas. What I would say is, in terms of the award reports, when they are clear about why we're giving excellent and good practice and why they need recommendations, it's much easier to see the full picture. So one of the things we will be asking from you as we're going forward is, when you're saying such and such is excellent practice, can you please add on why? Because sometimes what we see are in the reports, University A and University B look like they've got 2 really similar things. And in one report, it's excellent practice, and in one report, it's good practice. Now, if we dive back into all of the evidence and go looking for it, we can probably work out why one's excellent and one's good. But it would really help the university and us if you were able to say more clearly why you think it's excellent practice rather than just good practice, or vice versa. And again, we can use this to build understanding, we can use it to educate, and we can use it to persuade the sector to move forward. So I know I had hands going up. And do we have other questions? Did anybody else want to come in? Pick up just
Gareth, there's a couple of questions in the chat panel that I'm not sure. I think, Shell, you posed them, whether it was for Gareth or just for the group as a collective.
Yeah, no, I suppose I was wondering, in terms of this work going forward, where are we with the sector debate about duty of care and candor that's going on? I noticed that Bob Aberart actually had a wonky piece out, again, bringing up and keeping it alive regarding, obviously, his daughter. I suppose the other thing I was wondering is, looking back at my own institutions, I don't know how universities train business and industry board of governors in terms of that governance. So, because they've got a very different hat on, very different approach. And I suppose the last one was, do we use the testimonials of participating universities who had a brilliant experience, learned and really improved in a very overt way?
Yeah, if I take the last one first. So yeah, so the Library of Learning is one of the ways in which we're going to be doing that, very much so. And yes, we get universities to speak for us. That we've got universities, as Shell was talking about earlier, about, you know, when the conference in Scotland where Glasgow Caledonians spoke about it. So yes, we very much do, and we're going to want to do more of that over time. The question about governors is a really interesting one. We have actually spoken, there's a national organization for governors that we have spoken at before, and we probably do need to target again. But yeah, my guess is that actually lots of governors don't get necessarily any input around all of this. And so again, it's a thing for us to be thinking about how we're prompting the governors to ask those questions and have those conversations. In terms of duty of care, it's not really moved anywhere. It's kind of still just there hovering in the background. We're not hearing that there's any great desire on the part of the government at the moment to pick it up, but we're also not hearing that they want to close it down either. I think it's just sitting there as a question. I think what's happening in the background to all of that, though, is that case laws are really creating duties of care. Actually, if you look at the outcome of the Aberhart case, you know, that starts to bring clarity. There are a couple of court cases running through at the moment, which also would probably add to all of that. So it might just be that over time, case law defines all of this anyway. And so that might well be just what the government waits for to see. But, you know, it gets so complicated to define what we mean by duty of care and how it would apply and all of that, that I think, you know, people kind of start with the headline thinking, oh, yes, maybe this is something we want to do. And then as they get into the detail, they start thinking maybe it's not such a good idea. But we'll see. it's still hovering there. It's not really moved anywhere. So.
Right, one last question, only because Ben has sent some emails around about round tables, and that is the university task force, obviously left by the government support champion. I was just wondering where that is and how much influence that is having, really.
I'm not, well, it's been given that the task force is running until July, I think, of this year. I'm not sure if it's being renewed. I don't think we heard whether it's going to be renewed beyond that point. The government, when they came in, just give it another year to keep going. And then I think they're reviewing. I don't know what decision they're going to make about all of that. But yes, I'm aware there are some roundtables coming up to look at, you know, seeing whether we can bring clarity to any of those issues. But I'm not sure. Some of our other colleagues are sitting on those groups rather than me. Joe.
No, that's good, because one of them is about personal tutoring. So that's why I raise it, because actually you guys would be absolutely pivotal in feeding into it.
We have had invitations to them, so we will have people in the room. Yeah. Joe.
Yeah, I'm just interested in the insight report around, there's a few mentions of learner analytics, and there's a bit of nuance here and a bit of concern around some practice in the sector, and I didn't know if there'll be an opportunity later on to discuss that, or whether now is a good time.
We can talk about it now.
Yeah, because I noticed that it had identified it as good practice in a couple of areas, and I think there's a difference between, we've noticed the student, you know, their engagement or attainment is changing or isn't good to begin with, and therefore an intervention based on that information that we have. There's a difference between that and, well, we'll just get some demographic information and make some assumptions about whether or not they're going to be struggling based on that, and link an intervention to it, to going to an even scarier place. Well, we'll just embed a clinical measure into our learner analytics, and based on that measure, which we know isn't reliable and was never meant for that purpose, we'll decide who will and won't have proactive intervention. So there's obviously differing practice across the sector, from what seems like good practice to what I would see as harmful practice. But it's not obviously within the insights report, you couldn't go into that detail. And my concern is that other institutions will go to the insights report, go, okay, what's the good practice? What's the excellent practice? We'll go and adopt some of that. But if they don't understand the nuance, they might be adopting stuff that's harmful. Sorry, that was the lengthy statement, wasn't it?
No, it's a good summary where we are. I mean, I think, yeah, what you say is right. But I get that the question that comes back with all of this stuff always is, why are you doing it? What's the evidence base behind it? How are you ensuring that what you're doing is safe, effective, and accessible? How are you evaluating that in itself? So if you're collecting that learner analytic data in that way, how do you know what impact that in itself is having? And so what I would say as well, though, that in the main, we haven't seen anything like that kind of sophistication in terms of, certainly not the gathering of data using like clinical measures. We've not seen anything like that in any of the award reports. We've seen some use of what the second or the first of what you described, which was actually using things like engagement data to connect in with students when you notice that their engagement is disappearing. And that's the kind of excellent practice I think that we've talked about. We haven't seen anything like the we know this group struggles, therefore we're targeting all of them with this stuff in any of the kind of award reports that we saw. And yeah, I think a lot gets talked about in terms of learner analytics. And again, it's one of those things where the phrase itself is, we're not clear what we mean by it. It means different things to different people, exactly as you say. And there is, I guess, a risk of people picking it up. That might be driven by what's in the insights report, as you say, but it could also be driven by some of the other messages that are coming out. I've yet to see any convincing data on it being a major part of the answer. I think it can help, or in the margins, if you do that kind of noticing when somebody's struggling type use of data. But beyond that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, my concern is that, and it was Charles' question about the task force that reminded me of it, was the task force is driving the use of data analytics with embedded wellbeing measures, outcome measures in there, clinical outcome measures in there. So the sector will see a task force driving that forward, and the insights report saying, oh, there's some good practice here around learner analytics, or some excellent practice around learner analytics, and won't understand the difference between the two. So they will be citing the insights report and the work of the task force as their evidence-based, and who could blame them? Do you know what I mean? So if they don't understand the nuance.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is I'm not sure how much the outputs from the task force are actually having an impact.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one of the things I would say. The other thing I would say is that the report that came out from the task force that talked about learner analytics doesn't actually say that that works.
Mm-hmm.
So if you read that report through looking for guidance, you wouldn't come out of that thinking that that's the way to go, and that necessarily that's the way to go. It just feels like it's kind of unproven, really.
Okay.
So
that's helpful.
I'm not sure that that's true. Now, what I would say though is, what we also have to be aware of is there are some ethically governed, research-driven pieces of work that some universities are doing to try and collect well-being data from their student population, to try and do a proper evaluation of where is our population and what do we need to do about it. That actually looks like good work. So I can think King's and Ulster that I'm aware of in the sector that do this, that have done this. And that could be them. So there's real nuance around how is it being done? How is it being governed? What's the impact of it? How do you know that it's helpful? All the questions we would ask of anything else, we ask of this. And if what we come out of that is we are convinced that actually learner analytics are being used in a way which is really helpful and is helping us find students, reach students we might not otherwise have reached who are having difficulties, and therefore that's been helpful, great. If we're concerned that actually this is being used in a way where that people don't quite understand and runs a risk, then we highlight it, and if necessary, we make it a condition that it's addressed. But you know, I don't think we ever look at any one intervention and go, oh, if you're doing that intervention, it's fine. Because actually, you know, I'm a counsellor. I believe in counselling, but counselling can do harm. So it's about what's actually happening in this institution on the ground. How are you doing it? How is it governed? How do you know what's working? Irrespective of whether there's an evidence base behind the general approach. Yeah. Any other questions on any of that before we take a break? No? All good? Cool. All right. Can we then take a 10-minute break, please? So can we all be back at 11:49? Thank you. Well, I hope you've had a chance to have a break and move around a little bit and hopefully get a drink. So we're going to pick up where I'm going to move on in a moment to getting you to do a little bit of work in some breakout rooms, but just to introduce that activity and the topic that we're going to be talking about first of all. So we know that for students, belonging matters for their well-being, for whether or not they continue on to graduation, for their engagement with their course, for their enjoyment, and ultimately for their academic achievement. We also know that student loneliness is currently the strongest predictor that we can see of mental distress in the student population. And we know that the impact that loneliness has, particularly on students, is quite significant in that we know it impacts on cognitive functioning, ability to concentrate, memorize, access memory, and as a result, it has a direct negative impact on academic performance. We also know it has an impact on things like the functioning of our immune system. So if you take two groups, one who are experiencing loneliness and one who are not, and you expose them both to the cold virus, the lonely group are much more likely to get the common cold and much more likely to be ill for longer. Really interesting. Some recent research published about 2 or 3 weeks ago now, I think, actually suggesting that we can start to identify, we're starting to identify that when people experience loneliness, it changes the proteins within the body, particularly affects proteins that are responsible for things like inflammation, which may be why people who experience loneliness are more susceptible to becoming ill. So loneliness is a kind of whole system, whole function impact. So once our students are experiencing loneliness, it is having a quite broad-based negative impact on them. We're also seeing that particularly since the pandemic, there is evidence that higher rates of loneliness in the student population that kind of peaked, it would appear, in around 2023, but it's still much higher now than it was pre-COVID. We need to be a little bit wary about some of that data. It's a little bit mixed, but there seems to be some suggestion that there was a peak around 2023. Important also to say, in terms of loneliness, that once someone perceives themselves as being lonely, the kind of interventions that we would think of having a positive impact are actually less effective. So just engaging someone in social activity once they're lonely has a less positive effect. It's still positive, but it's less positive because people who are experiencing loneliness are more likely to ruminate on what they said wrong, how people looked at them wrong, what they didn't enjoy, and so on. So it becomes a less positive experience. And so it's once someone's experiencing loneliness for a significant period of time, it gets harder to bring them out of it. It's still possible, but it is harder. As I said, the post-COVID picture that we're hearing from universities in the analysis that we did is that actually it's becoming harder for universities to address this. Certainly the traditional ways that we've done this are working less well, as we spoke about earlier. Clearly, we're seeing students, many not coming onto campus for the same amount of time as before. That's partly due to just changes in social patterns that students have. Some of it's to do with the fact that students are accessing lectures and classes online rather than feeling they need to come into campus. And some of it's just about cost, just that students can't afford to come onto campus even for lessons sometimes, or they're having to go to paid work. So that then affects those who aren't coming onto campus, but it also seems to be having an impact on those who do, because when they do come onto campus, there are fewer people around, so there's less opportunity to engage socially, fewer kind of people who have the potential to be their friends. I've spoken about this a little bit earlier in terms of what the barriers might be to students coming onto campus. There's really interesting data coming out of Australia, and that suggests that only 30% of students have had an interaction with another student on campus outside of classroom activity. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily replicated in the UK, but it does certainly echo what we're hearing from colleagues in terms of the connection students are getting with other students. Now, of course, this builds on a lack of our understanding and knowledge anyway. So there's actually been very little work done to establish how student friendship groups form, what happens when students become socially isolated, or how student loneliness can be prevented overall. So we assume we know how students find their friends and how they find that sense of belonging, but we actually don't know. We've no idea how this whole picture takes place. There's no good research in it. There's been no real evaluation of what happens. And this is a kind of an ongoing gap. Interestingly, because lots of people think it's obvious, even though I don't think it is, it's also hard to get research to look at this because funding bodies just think, well, isn't it obvious? Of course, it isn't. What we see in terms of university activity is that a lot of the work around this is quite ad hoc Some of it can be really good. So some student life programs focused around residential accommodation, for instance, can be really good, and you can really see it's really well thought through, and there's evaluation and evidence that it's having some impact. But quite a lot of it is just kind of driven by maybe some academics who are interested in it, or some central services who have picked it up, or by student union. And there's less of a thought about across the whole university about what are we doing to ensure all of our students feel a sense of belonging, find their tribe, find their sense of connectedness, and feel that this is a place where they should be. And that in itself then means that there are lots of holes and lots of gaps that students fall into, and there are lots of students who can kind of go missing out of that picture. Another one of the problems that we have is that when we talk about community, I don't think we're really sure what we're talking about. So what community do we mean? Is it really possible to have one community that is the university? Or actually, do we have multiple communities within universities? And how do those communities then relate to each other? Because each community, by the definition of what a community is, each community is going to develop its own culture, its own rules, the ways people talk to each other, the way they communicate with each other. Universities will, of course, influence those if the communities are within the university, but they might exist quite separately. We can see this in all kinds of interesting ways. So, for instance, if you look at some of the research that people like Margaret McLafferty has done, or Emma Brogley has done around student help seeking, and we can see that there are very clear patterns of behavior within academic disciplines around help seeking that are different. Students on health courses and in education way more likely to be willing to seek help and to access support services than students in engineering, for example. And so there is something interesting about the fact that we have these different communities and these different cultures within our institutions, and yet we quite often talk about it as if it's one big community, when that's not actually clear. The other thing is that a lot of this stuff just grows organically, and as institutions, we don't really think about how we're influencing it. And we don't think about how we actually support the development and growth of healthy communities, and how we encourage healthy behavior within those communities, or whether there are hierarchies between our communities. Are some of our communities more prioritized, more thought about, more visible than some of the other communities who are maybe kind of less prioritized or less even considered? And how, if there are competing needs between those communities, how do we negotiate that? If one group wants one thing or wants another, or needs one thing and another group needs another, and those two things clash, how do we negotiate that? How do we think about all of that? And how do we do all of that in a way which means that the overall university community, if it exists, still remains cohesive? So there's a big, messy challenge here that I don't think we often recognize in the ways that we talk about this. In terms of what you're seeing, you've highlighted that there are actually universities quite often, as we said earlier on, making assumptions about how all of this happens, how it's a natural process, how students just find their tribe, find their people. And as a result, there are gaps, and some students just, fall into the gap. And in many cases where universities, when they were writing their reports and when they were doing their on-site visit, talked about community and social integration and belonging almost as if it was a separate thing, almost as if it was a kind of a nice thing that universities occasionally do to help with, but that isn't actually the responsibility of the university itself. And where the role of curriculum and the academic cohort just isn't considered in the same way. And of course, there's a challenge there for some academic programs when we think about this. I was a drama student initially when I was an undergraduate. Creating community in that space is much easier. It was a smaller group, but we had to interact, and by virtue of the program that we were doing. If you're a business academic with 250 students in a lecture theatre, that's a much harder thing to do. It's a much harder thing to think about. So that then creates an additional challenge as well. But as I say, we're using words like belonging. Belonging to what? Is that a physical thing? Is that a felt thing? Inclusion, community. But I don't think we have a fixed agreement about what we mean. And so that's then reflected in the way universities respond to that theme and talk about it overall, and in the ways that we feed back to them. Whose community are we prioritizing? What community is the most important? And again, when we're talking to students in the student focus groups, quite often one of the things we heard was some student groups saying, we think we're missed, we think we're not considered, we think we're not cared about. There's another case here about, for a community to exist and be cohesive, there have to be a set of social rules by which everyone operates. But there's also then a complaint from some people that what that then does is it places a restriction on their freedom of speech and freedom of behavior. And how do we balance those two things up and still have a cohesive community that's good for mental health and well-being? And there's also kind of a theory that for any social group to exist, it's defined partly by who's in and partly by who's excluded from it. And I think then there is a risk in us not thinking explicitly about our communities and how they're formed and what we're doing to engage with them, that some people end up being excluded without us realizing it, without us thinking about it. And that can be on the basis of demographic. Actually, one of the things we hear most often can be about the mode in which people are engaging with the university. It might be postgraduate research students quite often feel excluded, part-time students, commuter students quite often feel excluded because they're not thought about in the normal ways in which we do our business, in the normal ways in which universities do things like set assessment deadlines or when classes run or all of those kinds of things, or are provided with space. Quite often postgraduate students will say there's no space for us to even exist here. We're not even provided with that. Or where there's an assumption around postgraduate students, for instance, that they're old enough to go and find their own community. There doesn't need to be any support in place. There doesn't need to be anything in place to help those students gather together and feel that sense of belonging to each other and to the institution as a whole. And that clearly, we hear that again and again, and that's been in the research now for quite some time when we talk about that group of students. And then, of course, there are the other communities that we think about less when we talk about belonging, one of which is about the role of colleagues. And do colleagues feel a sense of belonging? And if that building block isn't already in place, where when students come through the door, they're meeting colleagues who feel that they belong to the institution, who feel that they have a community there, does that then have an impact on how much students are likely to feel that they belong? And again, there's more research published recently that the team at King's are part of, Nicola Barham and Juliet Stevenson, identifying that relationship between staff well-being and student well-being. You know, in thinking about student belonging, do we actually need to start by thinking about staff belonging? That also then means we need to extend our thinking potentially to areas we might not think about naturally, which is also, what about our leaders? Do our leaders feel that they're part of a community? Do our leaders feel that they're leaders of a community? Or do they feel disconnected and divorced from all of that as well? And actually, is that then a problem? Because if they are, then they may not understand the needs of their community in the same way. And as I talked earlier about the students who are often forgotten. So our role in all of this is obviously we want to use the charter to help universities develop what they're doing and to make sure that what they're doing is supporting good well-being and good mental health. And given the importance of community and that, you know, not feeling lonely is to mental health and well-being, we want to be using the charter to help universities think more clearly about this as a topic and develop interventions and practice and culture and community that actually then supports that sense of inclusion and belonging much more. So we want to help them take more strategic, cohesive approaches to social integration and belonging, to think much more broadly about what they're doing and to be evaluating what they're doing, to understand what the impact is and who's being left out. Our assessment, the overall assessment process in itself, and the outcome reports that you all write are fantastic opportunities to support that learning and development. So you, as we go through the award process, play a really important role in helping universities think in more nuanced, more complex ways about all of this, so that what they're doing can actually be really more effective and actually be tackling the genuine problems that are happening on the ground. So our questions for your work, and we're going to go into breakout rooms, and I'm going to ask you to do some work in that breakout room, and then we'll come back and ask you to share that, and we'll have more of a conversation between us as a larger group. First of all, how can we as assessors use the award process to support university and develop on this theme? And thinking about this in a couple of ways. One, if you think first of all about the interactions that we have with universities, the questions that we ask when we go onto the on-site visit, the conversations that we're having with colleagues through all of this, how might we shape our questions? How might we use the questions that we ask colleagues as an opportunity to educate as well as to gather information? Are there things we can think about? Are there things that we may observe that we want to talk about in doing all of that? Thinking about the structure of the assessment process. Are there things that we'll pick up in the focus groups that we can reflect into our questions when we're then meeting in the panels later on? How might we want to do that in a way which actually pushes forward thinking and practice in that university? And then, so excuse me, in our outcome reports and our recommendations, are there specific things we might want to highlight? Are there things we might want to talk about in those reports? Are there recommendations we might want to issue to universities to help them, to support them in that development and in that thinking? So we will go into breakout groups, probably into 2, I think, given the size of the group we have here today. I'll give you a good chunk of time where I'm going to, so if we take 25 minutes, so we'll come back at past, for you to talk all of that through. Can I just check before we go into that group, does anybody have any questions they want to ask or anything they want to clarify before I put you into that group? The slide has gone into the chat, so you can see what the questions are in the chat, just to double check what it is you're supposed to be doing. We all okay? Great. Okay, so Amanda, can we pop everyone into breakout rooms, please? And we'll see you back here at past. I hope you've had profitable conversations and useful conversations between all of that. So it would be really good to kind of get a sense, first of all, about your kind of overall conversations about student integration and belonging, if you had conversations about what you're seeing, what you're experiencing, what your thoughts are about it generally. And then we'll come on to what can the award process do to kind of support universities with this. So does anybody want to kind of feed into that, first of all, in terms of what your overall conversation was?
Shall I go first? So I've just put a whole load of stuff in the chat. So we were just having a discussion about it. And I think the thing that we were very thinking about is, what is belonging? There is no real definition of what belonging is. Is that the top strata, where basically if you feel like you matter, if you feel like you're included, but what helps you do that? Is it through engagement and things like shared values that you start to feel this? So, you know, just from the work I do, I know that belonging will vary by student characteristic, level of study and institution. So what are universities doing to understand what belonging, inclusion and engagement means for their university, their student body? Is mattering more important to understand than, say, the buzzword of belonging, which it feels like belonging has, it's, you know, Liz Thomas kind of created it, you know, raised it back in 2012, but it doesn't feel like we've necessarily moved on. Understand the words that students associate with belonging, mattering, etc. So we understand what they mean. So we need a proper definition of those kind of belonging, inclusion, engagement. What belonging means as a university community and further afield, such as the local community. Understand the priorities that impact on engagement, which helps facilitate maybe belonging. So understand concerns on data, on entry that can actually affect engagement. Prior loneliness, understand what the prior loneliness was. I mean, if you've got a student who is naturally lonely for whatever reason, because that's how they are, their approach to kind of help them have a sense of belonging will be different from, say, someone who's a social extrovert. You know, and issues could be that someone has moved, you know, far from home. They got no stability at home. They feel like an imposter. And awareness, the other thing is awareness of all the issues that are happening in the schools and colleges now that 10, 15 years ago are our pipeline that we need to address and deal with. So we're having to preempt. But also, if a student can't do much outside, which, hey, this is classic, you know, because they've got all sorts of other demands, how can, what's universities doing to build social activities into the curriculum that all students have a fair opportunity to actually engage with? So everyone in the group was brilliant and came up with some great ideas, and basically, you know, this is what I came up with.
I mean, all of that makes absolute sense, and I think you're right about the fact that I don't think we know what we're talking about, and I think we're really struggling to match to those words and to understand what they mean, and absolutely about the fact that some students are experiencing some barriers to that, and that we need to be thinking about that. And I think your point about if students already are experiencing loneliness in advance, I mean, loneliness isn't a natural state for anyone, but if you've been having a life that means you've been isolated, and that will be true for some of our students who've maybe had to hide their identity in some ways, or have felt that they didn't fit in where they already were. Actually, coming to university traditionally has been, for a lot of people who've been in that circumstance, the opportunity to find your place, because you move away from whatever it was that was there in the past. But is that still the case? Are there still those structures in place? Is that still happening? And do we need to think about that in a much more cohesive way? Jo?
I just wanted to come at it from a different angle. I mean, we had similar conversations, but we also explored what are universities doing to create psychologically safe places, places that aren't hostile? I mean, that was one of the areas that we're exploring. And then understanding how communities are engaging with the physical and virtual environment, you know, how they're using that. And I suppose for me, combining both of those is something like sports facilities, how we make sure they're not intimidating for some student groups. You know what I mean? So it was just looking at exploring it from multiple angles. But we did talk about, I don't think we ask enough about the strategic approach and what's informed the strategic approach, why they've taken that approach. And just because I don't think any institution is going to get this right at the moment, but it'd be good to understand how thought through and sophisticated their strategy is.
Yeah, that's a really good. Well, let's come on to the question zone. I just want to just to reflect on what you're talking about in terms of psychological safety, because I think you're absolutely right. That's a really important element of all of this, and that links then, of course, directly into what's happening in classrooms, about whether our students are feeling psychologically safe in classrooms, because we know that that's actually really important to students' ability to learn, and students who don't feel psychologically safe in classrooms learn less. So this again links back into Shell's point as well, making earlier on about linking back into classrooms, and are you using the classroom as a space in which everyone has an opportunity to have social connection, or not? But to come on and we think about the questions that we ask then, that question about the strategic rather than the what is it that you do, which I think is generally what we're getting from universities. We do these activities, but instead to ask that question around what's your strategic approach? Is there a strategic approach? What's the thinking? What's the evidence behind that? What evaluation are you gathering to understand what you need to do? I think is really important. Go on, you've put your hand back in.
No, just before we move on, I was going to say that we had a discussion about looking at, you might be embedding activities in the curriculum to develop social integration. But that can be really challenging if you've got a high number of international students who believe that being a good student is sitting quietly. You know, so I'm just thinking that it's really complex.
Yeah, it is. It is, absolutely. But then teaching is.
Yeah.
Teaching well is a complex task. And I suppose some of this is about how our colleagues are actually supported to develop those skills, and whether we just assume that, you know, because someone's got a background in research in an area, they can teach really well, rather than thinking actually what development and support are we giving them to develop all of that. Yes, but let's just come on a little bit, and I'm interested in those questions about, you know, what's your strategic approach overall. I think are really important. I'm interested in the other group when you were coming on to talk about what questions you might ask, or what conversations you might have, or what interactions we might have with people, particularly on the on-site visit. Did anything else come up in that around, you know, what we could do to help push this forward? Or was there anything else in the other group that you discussed around kind of questions or conversations and things that we might want to do?
I think one of the biggest things that came out of us, and we kept raising it, was what do universities actually understand by belonging? What do they? I mean, yes, we have lots of research coming out, etc., but what does it mean for their students? And I think that that's a question that's not being asked within institutions.
That's interesting. So that we could actually at some point pose the question: what definition of belonging are you using? What does belonging mean here?
Yeah. Or
that might be quite interesting.
What is the measurement? What is your, you know, the definition that you are adopting, or the definition you're adopting to kind of create that? And how are you doing it? Are you speaking to students? Have you done any focus groups to understand this more? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, Joe.
I mean, I think Michelle's just touched on it there. I was going to talk about student voice and co-production, but really, what are their underreached groups? What are they, you know, what are the groups that they believe they don't understand? Does that make sense? The ones that they don't understand their needs.
Yeah, I think, yes, absolutely. That's a really important question, actually, because I'll bet within every university in the country, there is a group that's less understood or less reached. Yeah. Hannah.
I think one of the things I'd be looking for as well is whether universities are taking like whether social belonging is thought about or considered when universities are making decisions about other areas of practice. So, for example, an example I gave my group, I work at Middlesex, recently just done a review of the learning framework, and one of those outcomes is that students are only expected on campus for teaching 3 days a week to allow them to undertake paid work or childcare. Obviously, really great benefits to that. And in that situation, I'm not saying it hasn't been thought of at Middlesex, but in that situation, I'd be hoping that the university would be able to report back to us on, yeah, well, we did think maybe this might have an impact on belonging. And so what we've done, or what we're thinking of doing, or our strategy revolves around this. So strategic decisions or operational decisions are being made with belonging in mind rather than as an adjunct, is kind of what I would be looking at focusing questions around as an assessor as well.
I think that's a really good point. And I think it's important to remember this is one of our enabling themes. It runs through so many of the other themes. And so it's not just about, what's the one place we ask this question. I can imagine we might want to ask this in our inclusivity panel, our leadership panel, student focus group staff, so that actually it's a thread that then runs through. And maybe just by repeating the question, it's an interesting thing that we get feedback from universities sometimes about, we were really surprised by how much attention got paid to X. And just by paying attention to something across a number of panels and focus groups, that in itself can emphasize to a university how important something is. So I think that's a really good point, Hannah. Thank you. Pras.
Hi, I'm just picking up from what Joe was saying about the underreach. The question we're asking was, when you make the recommendations, when you're looking at the evidence they've given you, and you look at the data, they may only capture a certain group. They may do very well, a service may be doing very well, but then when you look at how representative it is of the population, and those who are not using this service, doesn't mean that your service is working very well, because you're not, and are they going elsewhere? I think that's a question we were asking about, these certain group of students, if they are not engaging with the service. Because the example I gave was, I've had a comment made where we have a award-winning service, but then when you look at who are engaging with this service and who are not, would you say this is award-winning? When you look at the evidence, that's what I'm asking. How far do you go in terms of interpreting these and looking at how reliable these evidence are?
I think that's a really good point, and I think again, us making sure we're asking those questions, exactly that, about so which group hopefully some of this should be reflected in the self-submission itself. So when we read the self-submission, we say to students, we say to universities, where are your gaps? What are the things you need to work on? I would anticipate most universities will be able to say, there's this community we're really struggling with, there's this community we need to do more work with, there's this community we need to understand more. If they're not, as an assessor, I would want to ask a question about which are your underreached groups, because if you're not telling me on paper, then there's going to be somebody, and if you don't know that, then there's a gap in your understanding. You're just working with the people presenting to you, and you're not thinking about your whole population. So I would think that's really important, and I think when you get to the inclusivity panel as well, there's an opportunity to dig into that a little bit more as well. Joe.
I just think that moving across onto colleague, sense of belonging. At the moment, most universities do colleague surveys, and they're done by school or by service department, whichever way you're structured, and they frequently ask questions about sense of belonging to team, to department, to university. And that information is only reported in school and service. It's not looked at or analysed around ethnicity or disability or contract type, you know what I mean? So I just think that the same questions and the same piece of work needs to happen for colleagues as well as for students.
I think that's right. I think I absolutely agree with that. And I think we do ask universities to share with us any data that they've gathered around staff wellbeing. It's notable that quite often that doesn't come. And And maybe that's something for us as a team actually coming out of this conversation to think about emphasizing that a little bit more, and that if you've done not just around mental health and well-being, but if you've done stuff around sense of belonging and you've got questions like that on your staff survey, actually we want to see that data to understand that. And if it's been analyzed and broken down in different ways, we want to see that as well, because you're quite right, that may flag up some stuff that's really important. The other thing I would say is there's a really interesting thing sometimes when you look at the data that universities give you. We've had some universities giving us data and celebrating it as saying like, oh, 73% of students say they have a sense of belonging. Isn't that brilliant? And I'm looking at that going, well, what's happening to the other 27%? Because that feels quite high to me. And so sometimes there is an interpretation of data thing that actually we can push back to the university on to go, well, that's great for them, but actually what's happening to everybody else? And what are you doing? Who are these people who aren't? And is there any commonality around it? So sometimes it's about interrogating, going back and asking the question about the data they've already shared to say, so who are these people? What do you know about them? What are you doing about them? And if they're able to say, oh yeah, we know who those students are, they're these groups, this is what we're thinking about, this is what we don't know, this is what we're, then that you've got a university that's genuinely engaged. But if they don't know and they just think 73% is great, that then might tell us, maybe this isn't as good as we think it is, or as good as we would want it to be. Yeah. When we commented, did you get a chance to come on and talk about thinking about how you might then put this into outcome reports and recommendations? Did anything come out of that conversation? I know it's a big topic, so you may have got lost in other things.
Yeah.
Go on, Shell.
No,
And
we
I'll
didn't
come to
get
Joe.
there. We didn't get to that bit.
All right. Okay, go on, Joe.
The only thing we talked about is the need to weave the evidence into the questions. So you're framing a question with the evidence. And again, within the outcome report, it's useful to frame what you're writing based on evidence and linking to evidence, so that we're using every opportunity to educate and for helping universities to see the relevance, to understand why it's important.
Yeah, I think that's important in two ways. I think when we ask your questions, one, if we can get to the kind of the research evidence about what we know generally, but also if you're also able to link it to the evidence the universities have provided, you've told us this, we know this, so can you tell me? Is a really nice way of sometimes building questions up, because it gives people context and they're less frightened of the question when they understand why you're asking it. And again, then when we're giving our recommendations in a report, again, if you frame it in that way, in terms of the evidence we've got from them, what the evidence tells us from the literature, and therefore this is the gap, and that's why we're giving you this recommendation, that again becomes really clear for universities as to why you've said that and what you're responding to. Sometimes universities get themselves a little bit in knots when they get our recommendations back, because they think you've misunderstood. Quite often they will say the assessors haven't understood. And we have to have conversations with them to help them understand. And no, the assessors have understood, but here's the bit you're missing. And then when they get that, they go, oh, okay, right, we can see it now. So we want to reduce the number of times that happens, because then the emotional reaction that university colleagues are having to the outcome reports is reduced a little bit, and then they're actually able to take in what they're being told. So again, thinking about the framing of what you say, both in your question and in your report, to say what your evidence from the university you're responding to, what evidence from the literature you're drawing on, not necessarily referencing it or citing it, but just saying the evidence from the literature tells us this, or from research tells us this, or national guidelines tell us good practices. And therefore, we recommend the university does X. That then I think really does help set a much clearer picture for the university, and they're more likely to respond positively to that, I think. Yeah. Anything else from your conversations? Anything we haven't covered or talked about or got into that was useful in all of that? We all good? We are going to continue to kind of push on this theme and this conversation. Our first in conversation for the Library of Learning is going to be on this theme of social integration and belonging, because of exactly all the things that you were saying, Shell, around what we know, what we don't know, what we're talking, the gaps in what we're talking about, and the complications and the challenges that I think universities are seeing. And it's interesting, that example you were sharing, Hannah, of really well-intentioned decisions that we're making that can have negative consequences because you haven't thought them through properly. So thinking about that there is a balance to be struck between these different needs that students have right now, and that going to 3 days a week in the current circumstance does make sense, but it is a compromise on what's ideal because of the circumstance students are in. I mean, the ideal situation is students shouldn't be in the poverty. They should be able to come and engage fully with their university journey. And we need to keep campaigning for that at a national level to say, look, it's not okay that this is what the compromises we're having to make. So it's important also to keep in mind that, at Student Minds, the charter's part of what we're doing. We're also doing campaigning work elsewhere on other things. Cost of living is a big one that we're campaigning on. So I think that's really important too. Shell?
Yeah, I think one of my big frustrations, and actually, Bugay, who's the PVC EDI and education person, who's in the last year got into that role, she's very much an EDI champion, and she's absolutely right. Learning happens in the labs, the workshops. It doesn't work. Learning and that kind of relationship doesn't necessarily happen in a lecture theatre where you just funnel in, funnel out. So how can you maximize not only where learning happens, but where students do need to chat to one and do need to engage and try and underpin it there? So, when you've got a government who are just blanket saying you've got to get everyone back into 100% lectures, well, we know through COVID, learning really evolves. So how can we, as a sector, push back this blanket requirement where actually there's not a real decent rationale for why that needs to be the case?
Yeah, I think there's a kind of philosophical clash that we're actually coming to the heart of in all of this stuff, which is the difference between viewing universities as learning communities and viewing them as businesses, and students as students, or students as consumers, and as community versus individual. And I think learning happens better if you're part of a community. Learning communities encourage deeper learning, better learning overall. But while we perceive universities being places where individual consumers come and access knowledge as a commodity that you can just take away as if you're lifting it off the shelf, which is kind of the model we have at the moment, then you end up in a circumstance in which you do get a breakdown of community, less sense of belonging, and therefore less learning as a result as well. So you're right, because good pedagogy would tell you exactly what you're saying. If we want our students to learn more and understand more, you go in the opposite direction.
I was at Wonky at the November event, and I almost had a heart attack at the University of London, in that a cup of coffee was £4.80. How the hell can a student, when there's no other maybe coffee place on campus, afford £4.80 for a cup of coffee? Is it any wonder? That in itself is not enabling our students to have inclusivity.
Yeah, and the inequality of that across different universities as well is interesting, because obviously the universities that are better resourced subsidize the food of their students. And you look at the profile of those populations, and they tend to be the most privileged students as well. There's an interesting thing there. There's another interesting thing that I just wanted to highlight there in terms of challenges to social integration belonging. I talked earlier about the challenge for the academic who's got 250 in a lecture theatre or whatever. There's also a social integration belonging challenge for the really big universities. So if we think about those big universities, particularly those who are composed of institutes that have been welded together, so places like UCL, KCL, for instance, and there's other places like them as well, where we're actually having a cohesive sense of what the university even is really tricky. And it gets very easy for people to perceive the university as a them, an external other. We have our little department or our little institute, and that's what we belong to. And that can be a bit of a challenge as well in some respects. And so I think some of our thinking as we move forward needs to be a little bit thinking about, how do we approach this in different institutions? Because small specialists might not need to have a more complex strategic way of thinking about it, because it might naturally be the size that holds, and the fact that everybody's studying the same thing. If you're in an agricultural college of 200 students, that's easier to just naturally create community. Whereas if you've got 50,000 and 22 institutes, there's a whole other challenge there that we might want to see being addressed in a very different way, which goes back to, we always have to be aware of the context. So I think there's that challenge as well that needs to be part of our conversation overall. But that was really good and really helpful. Thank you all. Did anybody get any last questions anybody wants to ask before we look to break for lunch? No, we all good? All right then. Let's break for lunch then. And I can't currently, hang on, let me just see if I can get back to my I'm going to see when we're back from lunch. Yeah, so we're due back from lunch at 1:45, please. So can everybody be back in their seats with their cameras on just a couple of minutes before 1:45 so we can get going again on time? And then Nicola will be here to update us on the work of the Influencing Advocacy Group. But thank you all for your engagement so far. It's been really good. And we will see you all back here again just before 1:45, please. So I'm hoping everyone's had a chance to have a break and some lunch and a little bit of a refresh. We're just, I think, waiting for the last few people to come back. But we have Nicola with us. So, Nicola, can I ask you to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello. Sorry, I just realised I was not on mute. So if you could hear the dog thrashing around in the background, I do apologise. Hi everyone, I'm Nicola. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Insight Manager at Student Minds. So I am part of our influencing and advocacy team, working on our kind of change-making, policy insights, student engagement work, kind of on the other side of the charter. So with, well, with like the government and things, so less university facing and more the broader world of policy, I guess. So yes, I am here to just give you a little overview of what we're up to in case you're interested as active people in the world of student mental health. We gave this update at the in-person session as well, and got some really useful support and feedback. So we just thought we'd throw this in as a quick update from influencing and advocacy for you all. So yeah, as I say, this was our slide from the in-person session, and we haven't had the chance to update it. So excuse the fact it's a tiny bit old, in that the new government is slightly less new than it was when we first put this slide together, although still relatively new. We have been involved and shared a response to the NHS 10-year plan consultation, giving our thoughts on how we think the NHS can be better set up to support student mental health specifically. Lots of that comes from our section in the Student Mental Health Manifesto, which we published last April, I think, just before the election was announced. So if you're interested in any of that, I think our consultation response is public, but if not, have a look at the Student Mental Health Manifesto and you'll see our kind of positions and asks around the NHS and healthcare more broadly in there. We have also, of course, been watching the increase in tuition fees and maintenance loans. We are continuing to campaign for more financial support for students, recognising the impact that financial hardship is having on student mental health at the moment. And obviously, the increase in tuition fees, although small, can put students from marginalised backgrounds off coming to university. So we are trying to have an open conversation with the government, although that is somewhat one-sided at the moment, mostly us writing to them and telling them what we think they should do. But yes, a lot of that revolves around increasing financial support for students. They have said that they are reviewing, obviously, higher education funding, and we're expecting that by the summer. But we have written to them recently to say that we think that student finance needs to be improved to avoid students facing hardship with detrimental impacts to their mental health. We are also, now I can't remember what we were saying about the mental health bill. I think we are working with the, our chief exec is part of a group of chief execs of lots of different mental health charities, and all of them are keeping a very keen eye on the mental health bill and giving feedback around what we think is missing from that and what we'd like to see more of. A lot of it, I think, around early support hubs and that campaign that we are supporting. But yes, lots going on in the policy world. We have also just submitted, I believe, a response to a call for evidence around care, mental health care in the community, which I know Gareth was involved in putting together with our policy manager. So yes, we are working on lots of different policy things at the moment and trying to keep abreast of all of the different consultations, calls for evidence, etc., coming from this new government. Hopefully we will see change on the way, but all of our kind of input will be based on what we've said in the Student Mental Health Manifesto. So if you haven't read that already, I would encourage you to have a look there. We also wanted to let you know about some new research that we're conducting. So we're receiving some pro bono support from an organisation called Costello Medical, who are essentially doing the research for us with our steer, which is very generous of them. So we are exploring the impact of high risk, we've changed the wording somewhat, higher risk ways of making money on student mental health. So that includes things like gambling, investment, sex work, kind of buying and reselling items on the internet, that kind of stuff, based around kind of insight that we're seeing come through about the cost of living and the impact of the cost of living on students and their behaviours. So we are, this says we're about to kick off, but we have kicked off that research project with Costello. We will be recruiting students to participate in focus groups as part of that research. We'll be doing the recruitment at the end of this month for the focus groups to take place in March. So we may well circulate an expression of interest form with you all if you have any students in your networks that you think might be interested in participating in that research. More information will be available in what we circulate. But yeah, that's hopefully going to be a really interesting piece of work, and Costello have been really good to work with on that project. So hopefully, potentially a bit more of a partnership could be possible for future bits of research, we are hoping. Then over in student engagement, which is still our team, I realise it sounds like we're covering an awful lot, but still sits within influencing advocacy is our student engagement work. We are having, how do I describe? We're kind of re-kickstarting our student engagement. Lots of our opportunities kind of dropped off during the pandemic, which I'm sure lots of you can relate to. And we are really revisiting now how we can make sure that students' voices are front and centre of everything that we do, especially in kind of a policy and influencing perspective, but also across the Charter and other areas of our work as well. So we've launched a new Student Minds student community, which is a kind of very low intensity way of students to keep in touch with us, engage with us. It's where we will share any and all of our opportunities for students to work with us. So if you, again, know any students in your networks who might be interested in working with Student Minds in the future, or who at least might have an interest in filling out short surveys for us as and when, feeding back when we need students' voices on something that we think we might do, but we're not sure. Anyone that's interested in student mental health would be an excellent addition to our student community. So please do send them our way. The link to that is on the website. I will follow up when I stop talking. I'll drop some links in the chat before I shoot off again. I know that Shanae, I think, is thinking about the recruitment of more student assessors for this pool, which is very, very exciting. And she is going to be working with the influencing team and the student engagement team as well about how we can support student assessors in their role, how we can kind of facilitate peer support amongst student assessors as well. So if anyone here either is a student or assessor or has been in the past and has thoughts on that, please do send feedback in our direction, because we're really thinking about how we support all of the students that engage with us in whatever capacity that they do so, how we can make your experiences better, and yeah, encouraging more students to join our networks. And that the same thing basically applies to the student leads that we're working with as well in the University Mental Health Charter award process, thinking about how we can support student leads in their role as part of the Charter, if there's anything more that they need from us to kind of enable them to get the most out of the process from their own perspective. We'll be exploring that as well. So again, if anyone has any feedback about how we work with student leads, that would be very welcome. And finally, we are trialing, there's lots of new stuff on this, I realise. My brain is also trying to get a hold of it all. So excuse me if this seems overwhelming. We are trialing a new way of campaigning alongside Citizens UK. So Citizens UK are an organisation which specialise, they are experts in community organising. And that is an approach that we are trying to embed at Student Minds. So we've got teams of local community organisers across the country who we trained. We did one training session last week, and we've got another one tomorrow evening. We've got teams from, this is not the full list, I don't think, but York, Strathclyde, Bangor, Liverpool, John Moores, Sheffield, Hallam, Bristol. So we've got quite a few students, a lot of them are students, student leaders or students' union staff working with us on our new model of campaigning, in the hopes that we can kind of mobilise a bit of movement around student mental health again, with the aim of changing policy in the government. And again, all of that links back to our Student Mental Health Manifesto. We're hoping that our community organising approach will help us to kind of get some of the asks in the Student Mental Health Manifesto in front of the people who can put them in place. So if anyone is a keen campaigner here and would like to be involved, please do drop me an email and we can explore whether you've got a team in your institution already who have been trained, or whether we can set you up with kind of what we're doing there with Citizens UK. You would be very, very welcome. We are lacking university staff at the moment in that space, so particularly interested in getting university staff members. We're really keen on getting a diverse range of people sharing their experiences and their perspectives with government and with policymakers. So yeah, lots happening in influencing and advocacy team, but I'm sure lots of you will be interested in some of that. And if you are, please feel free to drop either myself a message, or if you know Dom Smithies, he is my manager, also part of the influencing and advocacy team, or Jenny Smith, our policy manager. We are the people kind of working on this in various different ways and capacities. So we would love to chat more. But hopefully that is a bit of a summary. I think that's everything. I'm assuming we don't have another slide, right? That's it. Good. Cool. I'll linger in case anyone has any questions, and I'll drop a few links in the chat. But otherwise, I'll pass you back to Gareth for the rest of your CPD. I hope you're all enjoying, and I'm sure I'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Can I just check and see, does anyone have any specific questions for Nicola now before we move on? Well, good. Okay, thank you, Nicola. And I think it is important for us to always have in our head that while we're working on the charter is one part of what we're trying to do overall. It's one of the things that we have to help support the sector and help universities develop and help improve mental health and well-being for staff and students right across the universities in the UK. But there's lots of other stuff that we're doing alongside all of that, and lots of stuff that we are adding to all of that. So you know, making sure that we continue to see the links between all of that and recognizing what's appropriate for the charter to push in, and when we need to be doing the work in other areas is really important for all of the things that we're doing. But nothing sits in isolation from anything else. Everything is connected to everything else. So let us then pick up. Did anyone have anything that came up into their mind over the lunch break or from the conversations that we had earlier? Anything anybody wants to check in on or just ask any more questions on before we move on to our next exercise? No, we're all good. All right then. So we're going to talk then in the next section about, I think particularly about culture and feedback and why all of this might be important. So one of the things that emerged in the analysis of the outcome reports is the importance of culture really came through. Now, that said, it's kind of a difficult thing to pin down what we mean when we're talking about culture, but in quite a few of the reports where either culture was really good, and this was usually in universities who got the award straight away, assessors made a specific point of talking about the culture that they'd encountered, feedback they'd had from staff and students about their experience of the culture, what they'd seen while they were doing the on-site visit, and so on. And so, and it really did feel as though there's a real clear link between those universities that had appeared to have really good culture and those universities who are ready for the award straight away. And alternatively, where there seemed to be some problems with culture in some universities, this also aligned with universities where there were gaps in their practice, gaps in their whole university approach. So we can't say it's absolute, but there did seem to be an association between the two things. As I said, it's hard to understand what the evidence is behind those judgments, though, because when reading the reports, we can see comments like, you know, from talking to staff, it was evident that there was a good culture, but there was nothing that said what that meant or what staff meant by good culture or what the assessors were taking to mean good culture. I think I would say, though, as somebody who has assessed, there's something tangible about being there, particularly when you go to the on-site visit, when you've been there, maybe not right away, but when you've been there for a while and you've had a few focus groups and panels and you're starting to get a feel for it and you're starting to see how things work, there's a tangible connection to what the culture feels like for a lot of people in there. And you can feel when people are coming in and they've been rehearsed and they're maybe trying to cover stuff up and they're worried about saying the wrong thing. And there's clear hierarchies within the room about who answers questions when. And when you're in a university where the culture feels much more comfortable, people feel open to just muse and maybe say things wrong, get things wrong, and are more interested and engaged with the genuine problems. There's a tangible thing that you pick up on, but it's hard to quantify what that is and hard for us to kind of report back on exactly what that is and what we're seeing. We know that from the research in this area, we know that there is a clear relationship for all of us between the culture we find ourselves in on a day-to-day basis and our mental health. So that's going to be true for staff and students in any institution where there is a healthy culture that's going to help support good mental health. Where there is a negative culture, where there is toxicity within the culture, that is going to impact negatively on mental health. And so we need to be aware of that because it is quite a big factor. One of the things that comes out of a lot of organizational work and research, and one of the things that also seems to come out of these reports, is that actually culture seems to be more important than structure and process. That whatever structure universities have and whatever processes they're using, culture seems to either override or undermine it. You can have good structures and good processes, but poor culture, which creates negativity. Or you can have culture and structure and processes that aren't quite there and don't quite work, but good culture makes up for it, because people will work to support each other. Also important to say, however, that can also become a negative over time. So we have had some instances where universities staff talked about the culture that they were in and how great it was and how much they appreciated it and how committed everyone was to the university. But what that actually resulted in was a bit of exploitation of staff, and staff actually working really long hours in a way that wasn't really sustainable and was negative for their well-being. So we've got to be careful of that too. I think it's also important to recognize that culture is really hard to change, and it's an amorphous thing. It's really hard to pin down what we mean. What are we actually talking about here? And shifting it, particularly within universities, is really quite difficult because they are quite often siloed because of the nature of it, because we have departmental silos, faculties and central services and so on. It can be difficult to get all of those bits all moving in the same direction and behaving in the same way at the same time. So it takes quite a lot of effort and quite a lot of push to get to that point, to actually get culture to change. So when we're actually assessing the culture, then it's really great that we're picking up on it, and it's really important that we're picking up on it. But we need to think clearly about what is it we're seeing, hearing, assessing, and how do we give some clearer guidance back to universities about that culture, about that thing that we're seeing. What is it that we're seeing? What is it that we're actually telling them about? So I guess our questions that we have that come out of that is, how do we become clear in what we're seeing and hearing that tells us about culture? And how do we feed that back more clearly to universities and what they could do to improve? So our exercise. Can I ask you in groups to think about what tells you when culture is good and when it is not? If you've done an assessment, draw on that experience, please. If you haven't done one yet, if you think about culture where you work, or if you've been into another institution in another role at some point, what would tell you about when the culture was good and when it was not? And try to be specific about what we're actually seeing, hearing, or experiencing. What is it we are picking up on? What is it that we might want to be able to report on specifically? And then when you've got that, can you imagine you've been to a university for an on-site visit and you've identified the examples that you've just come up with, the specific things you've just identified that you were talking about? How would you report that back? So how might you craft a sentence for the outcome report that actually says, we saw evidence that the culture was good from, and then whatever it was that told you that culture was good, or whether there are things you could, how might you craft a sentence to say that the university may need to address some problems within their culture? How might we put a sentence like that together to put into the report? And I'm really trying to think about when we talk earlier on about when we're putting things into evidence. What evidence are we seeing from the university? What evidence might we want to point to in national guidance or research? And therefore, what might we want to say to the university on the basis of what we've seen? So imagine you've been up on one, or if you want to draw on an example, if you've got somebody in your room who's actually done an assessment before, then you want to draw on an example, that's perfectly valid as well. So think about two things. First of all, what tells you when culture is good and when it isn't? What are you seeing specifically, hearing, experiencing? And then how might you report that written up in the outcomes report? And then when we bring you all back together again, we'll ask you both of those questions. And if you can share your sentences back with the group, that would be really great. So if we take a little bit of time on this, so if we take maybe, again, 25 minutes, so if we come back for past, and then we'll take your feedback on all of that, and we'll have a bit of a conversation, and then we'll take a break before we go on to our next thing again. Everyone happy and clear about what we're doing? Anybody got any questions about that? No, we all okay? All right. So again, the questions are in the chat. So Amanda, if you can pop everyone into 2 breakout groups for me, please. hope that was a useful conversation, and that was you got somewhere with the exercise. Can I just first of all start with the first question in terms of what might tell us if a culture is good and what's not? What specifically might you see, hear, or experience? Those of you who have done assessments already, what did you see, hear, or experience? I'm really interested in all of that. Does anyone want to start there? Joe?
I think people crying is normally quite a good indicator that something's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to be more specific about when crying would particularly be bad?
Yeah, I think that I can think of at least 2 assessments that I've done where colleagues have got visibly distressed when talking about their workload.
Yeah, I think that yeah, absolutely, and I think we've seen that in a number. And I think you're quite right. I think if we're in a situation where staff are crying when we start to talk to them about their workloads, that's clearly an example of something which is problematic, to say the least. Yeah, so that is a very clear thing we can point at. Definitely, yes. Anything else? Anybody else get any other examples that they'd like to share? Shell, I can see you've popped something in chat. Do you want to just pick up on what you've put there?
Team 1, do you want to talk to them?
Yeah.
Chelsea, Chelsea and Hannah talked about a couple.
Yeah, no problem. I think one of the things we spoke about is I haven't had this experience on an assessment, but some of the others possibly had, around answers in panels feeling quite scripted, and feeling that, you know, it's really difficult to actually get them to answer the question you're looking for because they've had a specific, almost like a rehearsal. Like I say, I haven't had that experience as an assessor yet, but I think a sign of a really good culture is, you know, obviously you don't want people constantly saying, oh, I don't know the answer to that, to every question that you ask, but people at all levels feeling able to be quite authentic and say, oh, I don't have the answer for that on me at the moment. Or again, like maybe even a colleague has said, this is the way we do. I don't know, like I think there's you don't want people doing it all the time, but that openness to feel a bit more vulnerable and like be okay with that is important, and would give me a nice green flag.
Yeah, I think that's really true, Hannah. And I think I've seen some occasions when we've asked a question and the person's kind of gone, that's a really good question. We need to think about that more. And we don't think we have done. And that's a really kind of good, genuine reflection about, actually, do you know what? Yeah, you're right. That's a gap for us. We need to do, I think you said, that willingness to be humble, to be vulnerable, to actually try and learn from what they're doing. You know, all that is, I think, is really good and really important. One thing about the scripted thing, I think you're absolutely right. It is a thing we need to be aware of and to be concerned about, and to try and push people past that. We should also be aware that sometimes people are quite nervous about coming into the panels, and sometimes the scripting, particularly at the beginning, is just a way to protect themselves, to feel okay. And I think we can be all right with that to begin with, and then help just gently guide people out of that and make sure it's okay. Normally what we find, I think, is you get that at the beginning, and then your conversation can take people out of it a little bit more. But I think at the beginning, I think it's understandable that people want to feel really prepared.
And I think it's about the way that the assessment team set the culture in the room for those panels as well. I think if you're generally, as an assessment team, we're probably doing quite a good job if actually at the beginning they come in and it seems a bit scripted, and by the end everybody seems a bit more normal, basically.
Yeah.
So I do think we've got a part to play in that as well, if we're noticing it being scripted, to help them unscript.
Yeah,
I think as I've gone on, done some assessments, safety, creating a safe environment where staff feel that your body language isn't like, you know, you're not trussed up in a high suit, and you're relaxed, and you know, so that, you know, staff are always going to be guarded and a bit reticent at the start, and it's about how we can actually create that professional, safe environment that encourages staff, you know, and if someone actually, we were saying, has got, you know, ADHD or something else, where they're just reticent and they're just worried, but actually they are the expert, they need to be present. So it's about us understanding that, and as one of the groups said, don't make judgment based on vibes. I think it was Minty actually, or dynamics. Even if it's feeling weird or disjointed, try and ask questions. I mean, you know, I think we've all been at assessments where you've asked questions and you just don't get the answer, and then you're just being going around in a circle and no one actually gives you the response.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a lot in that. I think you're quite right. And just back to Hannah's point about the what we do to set the culture of the room, you're absolutely right. That's really important, because otherwise the negative culture we see might be the one we've set. And we don't want people to feel that they've been interrogated. We don't want this to feel like this is something which is adding negatively to people's well-being. We want it to feel like a positive experience. And I would say, in general, what happens when people come out of those sessions is they give us positive feedback about what it feels like to have been in there, that it felt positive, like they were able to contribute, that they felt like there was a genuine conversation. So that's great. That's what we want people to have. But yeah, absolutely, we want to make sure that's an inclusive space and that we're not then judging culture and what we've seen. And the point about vibes is important because it can steer you in either direction. You can be more negative or more positive than is warranted because of the feeling of being in there. I think that's very true. Fran, you had your hand up, and then Joe.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on a couple of points that have been made about how we set the scene for the room. And something that struck me on site visits that I've been on is, I guess, familiarity with being in that kind of environment. And being someone who stopped after undergrad, I've seen that people who probably have more of a shared life experience with me, that they haven't been through something like a Viva and aren't used to potentially, and maybe that's also speaks to the culture of the institution, but being questioned about their work, and not as a point of criticism, but to understand more about it and feeling comfortable with somebody questioning them. And I think that again speaks to how the sessions are set up, the kind of atmosphere that we as the kind of the assessment team and the award manager create when we go in there, and how, as you say, that kind of safe, comfortable environment.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think there are parts of the universities where people will be really used to external people coming in and questioning them. And that may not have been a very good experience, which is also something we should bear in mind. And there are parts of the university where this will never have happened before, and people may be a little bit shaky about it as a result. Yeah, absolutely. Joe?
I'm just reflecting on times when we have got that rapport and that relationship's working well in the room. And then we've had disclosures of, I know the VC said X, but this is happening in reality. Or I know the policy says this, but this is happening. So at that point, there's that kind of, they feel confident enough to disclose things. And so you start finding discrepancies sometimes, which is a strong indicator that something's not right, shall we say.
Gareth, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I think one of the interesting things that we've learned from all of this, and you're absolutely right on this, is that actually building that rapport and making the space safe actually gets us to more of what's actually going on than on occasions, particularly in the early days when one or two of us might have taken a more inquisitive, interrogative line. Actually, I think the walls went up very effectively when that happened. And people were quite able to defend themselves, and we didn't get to what we needed to get to. I think that creating that psychologically safe space, building that rapport, having those conversations, making people feel confident in us, actually then people are more likely to tell us what's really going on. I think we get a much better understanding.
Can I also add that from my own experience, when my university had its assessment, the clinical assessor was exceptional in that she was saying things to the room like, I'm really excited to read about this work that you're doing. Can you tell me more? So it was framed in such a positive way that, you know, I could see my team just immediately getting excited and wanting to tell her everything about it. You know what I mean? So it became a really natural conversation that they could have been there for hours talking about it, but she was just very skilled.
Yeah.
Very positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's when our assessments do work at their best. And I think it's also when our assessors get to what's really going on, including the problems, because actually once people are talking about that, it's easier to tease out what's not working, you know. So yeah, absolutely. Shell?
Let's just say, you know, as an assessor, go in, the glass is half full rather than the glass is half empty. And, you know, and that's really important, especially as we keep saying to institutions, we're not assessing you based on other institutions. We're assessing you based on what you have submitted. And I think it's really important for us to keep reminding ourselves of that sort of, well, we don't do that in our university like that, you know, but and it's it's important not to kind of let that creep in.
Absolutely, yeah, completely, yes, because otherwise we can be imposing our model on theirs. Very good. Okay, we're going to come on and talk about excellent and good in a little bit as well, in a little bit more detail. So let's hold that for a moment, because I think that's really important. Can I come on and ask about did you manage to get to a point where you were creating some sentences or paragraphs to pop into a report? Did either group get to that?
Chelsea, over to you.
Come on, Chelsea.
Yeah, we came up with a bit of one. So we talked about just scrolling through Michelle's notes. So for example, we were talking about a panel where perhaps people weren't being very open, things felt very scripted, and it didn't open up despite efforts. So our sort of template vague response based on our made-up scenario was, in this particular panel, the majority of participants struggle to answer questions or elaborate on their thoughts. They seem to stick to similar responses. The assessment team interpreted this as a potential issue of hierarchical culture and a lack of openness and safety.
Sure, yeah, I can see that, absolutely. I think if we're going to, I think we might need to add points to, I mean, and I guess I haven't given you enough time to do the exercise fully, so yeah, completely. But I think one of the things that we would need to add to that then is why we're thinking about that as hierarchy, rather than we've got a group of people in the room who are really nervous.
Yeah, we discussed things like, like, especially like from my perspective, I was in a panel where the more junior people sat very quietly, and the only person that really spoke was the most senior person in the room, and that was sort of a sign. And we discussed even if everybody is answering, they all kind of look to the same person in the room before giving their answer, almost like they're looking for permission or guidance before they open their mouths, that kind of thing.
And so that, absolutely, and that's a very specific point of evidence that we could highlight and have done in previous reports, absolutely, where you were saying the assessment team noted that junior staff deferred to the more senior people in the room and looked to them for guidance when asked questions, because I think that does tell you something about how confident those staff are, either in their own knowledge or in the culture. And I think absolutely you can point towards that. Yeah, very good. Yes. Our other group, did we have a sentence?
Yeah, Joe, did you want to, or I was the one writing it down, but we used Joe's example of staff, crying in the focus groups, and that was related to workload, academic workload in this case. So what we sort of said was staff consistently talked about how effective line management is, and this was also evident in the colleague survey. However, colleagues within the focus groups identified that expectations were unreasonable, requiring them to work excessive hours, and at times became distressed about this. Based on these observations, the assessment team would encourage the university to take steps to review how the academic workload is allocated, is impacting staff well-being, and how to create a healthier work environment. That's very good.
That's very good and very specific. That's exactly, I think that. So exactly that, and then in taking that, in which we're saying, here's a positive thing the staff have said. However, here's a very specific thing they've told us about it. They've identified it's impacting in this way, and here's a very clear recommendation as a result of all of that. And whilst the university may not want to hear that, it's very clear what the evidence line is and why it leads to that specific recommendation. Yeah, very good. And I think the more we can make our recommendations look like that and structured like that, and a bit like when Chelsea was talking earlier about pointing to, we've observed this hierarchical behavior, and therefore we're telling you to we're putting a recommendation together because of this. The easier it is for universities to understand what we're saying, why we're saying it. They will probably know deep down that what we're saying is true, but because we've very clearly explained this is what we've seen, this is why it's a problem, therefore this recommendation, it just makes it a clearer, easier thing for them to absorb and to think about what they're going to do about it. I think that really helps everyone learn and develop and move on from that now. Great, thank you, everyone. Can I just ask, does anybody have anything else they want to talk about? Right, Shell, go on.
Yeah, no, it's just a bit of a comment. I mean, I think it's about us enabling senior leaders to understand this is about honesty. And one of the first things that when we were being assessed, at UEL was I just said the academic advisor scheme is broken, and we are working hard on trying to get it into a working mode, because everything is just, it's just overwhelming for absolutely everybody. And straight away it changes. You could see the assessors just changing the way that they talk, because we were honest. And I think it's about, you know, letting staff be honest, that it's not the end all. Because actually, if I try to claim, oh no, it's working, and then you guys kind of found out actually it's a crock of poo basically, and it is broken, it just doesn't give the trust of the assessors about what we say. And so straight away it's a red flag. So I think that honesty, especially universities are going through hell and high water, we know that as assessors, so being honest is just important.
Yeah, just taking your scenario there, Michelle, either one or two things is happening. Either you're trying to hide it or you're unaware of it. I'm not quite sure which one's most scary. But you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that I think is probably important for us to think about doing as assessors when we first arrive is in our introductions and in our introduction in each panel, highlighting the fact that it's a team of peer assessors. That this isn't, you know, because sometimes I think people think it's like, oh, we've got a load of external people to come along who don't really understand how it works. But actually really being clear about the fact that your assessors are people who work in universities, who know how universities work, who know the drawbacks, who know the pitfalls, know all the things that we all want to try and cover up. So let's just start there, shall we? Rather than, you know, this is a group of external consultants who don't really get it. Because I think that matters too. The fact that it's a peer who's assessing you, I think is you know, is more comforting, but also tells you that you're not going to be able to pull the wool over people's eyes in quite the same way. And it's better to just have that honest conversation. Absolutely. I think that makes sense. Anybody want anything else they want to say in terms of culture before we move on? We'll take a break in a moment. No, we all good? All right then. So let me just in terms of as I say, we'll come back to that actually. Let's just take a break now before we move on to that. Can we just take 10 minutes, please? And can we all come back then for 3 o'clock, please? Yep. Is anybody got any questions or anything about anything we've covered so far, or anything we haven't covered that you were hoping we were going to cover today? Before we move on, just to make sure I'm not missing anything. No, we're all okay? Cool. Good. All right then. So we want to come on and talk a little bit more about the way in which we kind of clarify, particularly around good and excellent practice. So there are some specific reasons around this, some of which are to do with, again, being clear with universities, and some are to do with our ability to then be able to extract information from the reports when we come back and analyze them. And as I said earlier, there was times where it was really difficult to tell the difference between excellent and good practice. We'd have similar things in two universities. And in one university, it would say it was good practice, and another it would say it was excellent practice. And it was hard to tell what the difference was between the two things. And sometimes it almost felt as though it depended on whether the assessor had heard of a similar example to this or not. So if it was the first time an assessor had heard of an example of something like this, they thought it was excellent. Whereas if they'd heard other examples of similar things, they might have thought it was good. But there was nothing to quantify that. There was nothing to kind of help us understand why it was, particularly for the excellent practice. Quite often it was just listed as X is an example of excellent practice, or X is recognized as excellent practice. So we need to kind of think about, well, what's the kind of level of detail we need to go to help universities recognize why it's excellent or good? There are a few reasons for that in terms of thinking about universities themselves, because actually there's a really odd thing that happens in universities, which is that whenever something's really good and it's recognized externally as being really good, universities then get rid of it. And it's an odd thing I've never quite been able to explain, but I do think sometimes it's because it's hard for people to kind of understand why this is excellent, because people work in a bubble within their own institution. They don't have the reference to the rest of the sector. They can't see how it measures up against other things. And actually being able to say, not just that this is excellent, but why it's excellent. What is it about this is excellent? What is it about this that's important? I think then helps that excellent thing be defended and be protected when changes are then happening in the university in future. Also, I think it's important when we're thinking about this, when we come on to writing about conditions, because when we're setting those conditions for universities, we are setting the thing for this is what you need to do in order for you to get the award. So we have to be really specific about that so that the university understands what's being asked to do, but without us being prescriptive about how they do it. And that's a tricky balance. And let's recognize that right at the very beginning, that it is a tricky balance. Because very often universities will either want to say, well, just tell us how to do it, or you're being overly prescriptive. I thought this wasn't a prescriptive exercise. And so finding that sweet spot in the middle is really important. We do need to be clear. And again, this goes back to some of the things we've been talking about earlier, about the evidence that we're drawing on, the conclusions we've drawn as a result of all of that, the evidence as to why that's important. And then therefore, the university needs to do this as a condition. And what we generally try to say within those conditions is we will try to say something along the lines of, let's take the classic one around services not being able to be demonstrated to be safe and effective. We'll give some guidance around the fact that university needs to do something to evaluate its services in order to be able to demonstrate that it is safe and effective. And then we will give some guidance around, if you're going to use outcome measurement, this is what you must do. And if you're not using that, whatever you do must be as robust and systematic as outcome measurement. In other words, universities can't demonstrate that they're doing this by gathering feedback from 5 students. So finding that balance, but still being clear, is really important. I'm just putting this up here because this is actually what we put down in terms of we're going to focus on the difference between excellent and good practice a little bit, but there are differences in the way we describe those two. So when we're talking about excellent practice, we're actually saying that we can see that it's had a positive impact on mental health and well-being, and that we think this example is actually so good it would be of benefit to the whole sector if it was shared and more widely understood by other institutions, that if other people learn from this, it would be really helpful elsewhere. Whereas good practice is when we say, actually, this is what we would expect to see in a university that's doing a really good job. If it's evidence-based and clinically informed, good practice, and we've got a little bit of an evidence to suggest that it's having a positive impact on well-being, and that it's right for the local context. So good practice is, yeah, this is the kind of good, solid work we would expect to see in a university that's got an award. It's on a par with good practice elsewhere within the sector. This might not necessarily be a completely new thing, but that doesn't matter because it's solidly evidence-based, it's adapted to this population, and it's clinically properly informed. Whereas the excellent practice is, well, this is so good, we really should be telling other people. Other people should know about this because other people could learn from this. Does that clear to everyone the difference between the two things? Yeah. And I think having that in your head when you're deciding whether something is excellent or good practice is really important. And coming back to those descriptors, which are always at the beginning of your reports, they're automatically put at the beginning of the report to help you. Going back to that when you're thinking about, is this excellent or is it good? Just to reflect on that. And when you're having your conversations in your teams about excellent or good, coming back to that is really helpful. And actually even including some of this language sometimes in your descriptions of why it's excellent or why it's good can be really helpful. So this is the kind of thing that we sometimes get. The assessment team recognizes the development of the student life program as excellent practice. And it's great that we're seeing it as excellent practice, but why is it? Why is the development of the student life program excellent? What is it that's excellent about it? Why is that excellent and not good? Is really hard for us to say from that sentence overall. Or the work of the student life program is recognized as good practice, which we had in another report. And again, here we have 2 student life programs, and I'm not sure why there's a difference in the judgment. So how do we explain to universities why something is excellent or good practice? We're going to do a little bit of practice in that in our groups. So let's take a student life team as an example. What would differentiate if you're going to have a student life team and you're thinking, so student life teams, for those in case you don't know it, student life teams tend to be those teams that are based usually within accommodation, but sometimes they have a remit that's wider than that. And their role usually is about, student socialization, belonging, lots of activities, all of that kind of thing to help students get that sense of connection, belonging, and friendships. So what would differentiate between excellent and good practice in this kind of example? Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. Okay. So let's just take that. If we can just do a quick, where are we? 10 minutes on that. And then if we can just get you to feedback a little sentence that would, or actually not that sentence. If we just come back and just have a conversation with me when you come back about what you think the difference would be between a student life team that was really excellent and one that was doing just good practice, the kind of practice we would expect to see in a university that had a good whole university approach. Yeah. So if we can put everybody into breakout rooms just for 10 minutes, please, Amanda, and I'll see you all again in 10 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully that will have been a useful conversation. Can I ask people then to just give me some examples of what you think would differentiate between good and excellent practice for this example of a student life team? What did you come up with in your conversations? Who would like to go first? Don't make me pick.
I'll jump
Thanks,
in.
Chelsea.
So one of the things that we spoke about was the difference between being just reactive, so just responding to an issue that's already presented, providing advice once a student already presents, providing financial support or social support after a student presents. But actually, what do they do to be proactive, to prevent crisis, to educate, inform, and support students and staff as a whole, while recognizing different cultural needs, different needs from people of different backgrounds, etc. How do they respond and proactively support in a unique way, recognizing all those differences?
Okay.
I put two examples that we spoke about in the one is finance. So an example of good would be a financial team providing support with data tracking, with bursaries, grants, how they're distributed and the impact, being aware of the current financial pressures, etc. Excellent would be careful structure of eligibility criteria to maximise need, embed financial advice into modules in the curriculum as part of business and employability, integrating financial importance throughout all of the themes so there is an awareness, being proactive rather than reactive, demonstrating innovation and support, anticipate issues and being proactive. That's just one example. That makes
nice sense if you think about that kind of way. Okay, yeah, that's really good. Thank you very much. Joe.
Full evaluation.
Yes, would be nice.
Yeah, I mean that would be making it excellent.
Yeah, a fully robustly evaluated intervention would definitely be something that would push it up to excellent. And I guess there's two ends to that, really. I guess one is about whether a thorough evaluation has been done, but also then how is that evaluation being used to inform that whole process. So that again, if we saw that whole process, that is something that would probably push it into excellent at the moment, given where the sector is with evaluation overall. So we've had that kind of proactiveness. We've had the consideration of diverse population properly within the design of the intervention. We've got the use of evaluation. These are all things that might mark something as being excellent. Anything else that people identified as being something that might push something up into that excellent box?
I did take a couple of notes.
Go on, Ava.
Which was, we also had sort of genuine co-creation with a sort of clarity of purpose of what is being co-created, how that co-creation is going to be delivered, and how services co-creation and evaluation will be delivered. So sort of just really clear structures within a service of how they, deliver from sort of start to finish.
That makes absolute sense. Yes, and particularly I pick up that co-creation thing being so important about all of this as well. That in the use of evaluation and the use of evidence, it's not just about the use of numbers. It's also about hearing the voices of the people who are experiencing whatever they're experiencing and who are going to be using the service or working with the team. So we've got that kind of sense of co-creation, that sense of proper governance and structure, proactiveness, inclusivity, and the evaluation, properly evaluation, and then using all of that back into that whole kind of governance cycle to then see that ongoing improvement. And if we're seeing all of that, those are things that we can very definitely point to as being excellent practice, so that when we're then writing up in our award report, we can say this is excellent practice because it was proactive, it was fully inclusive of the full population, it showed robust use of evaluation to develop. And that then I think gives a really clear explanation to the university as to what it was about the initiative that particularly raised it up to excellent practice. Joe.
One of the challenges we were discussing was that sometimes we identify something as excellent practice because that specific intervention is unique. We think it's sector leading. But then we're relying on our knowledge. And two of us both acknowledge that we don't even know always what's happening in our own organisation, as we know, however much we try to know. So it's hard to have knowledge of what is sector leading across the entire sector.
Yeah.
But we're relying on that.
It is. This is why we have also shifted our structures a little bit, so that as well as now having your assessment team, obviously our award managers are becoming more informed as they're doing more and more of these awards, and you also have the report review at the end of all of this as well, which has got we've got three kind of colleagues now who are kind of well plugged in across the sector and well informed, and you know, don't undervalue the level of knowledge and understanding that all of you have. It's the reason we wanted you as assessors in the first place. If you take all of that together and all of the experience we're building up and what you've seen in the insights report so far, that's quite a large amount of expertise. Now, we're never going to know everything that's happening in the sector. It might well be that this is the first time we've come across it. There's 12 other universities that are doing it, but the universities we don't normally engage with. That's possible. It is absolutely possible. It doesn't necessarily stop this being excellent practice, though. If it's underpinned by all those things that you were all just talking about, you know, if it's really been well co-created, if it's got a good evidence base, if it's been well evaluated, if it's, you know, you had that level of proactivity and inclusivity, it could still be excellent practice. And people could still learn from that, because if it's something that a whole assessment team and the award manager and the award reviewer have never heard of, it's probably worth sharing anyway. Shell.
Yeah, no, it's just an observation of an assessment that I did. I think, you know, me and the team, we were so overwhelmed because so much was being done that it felt like it was excellent practice. But actually, they was just doing an awful lot of standard practice that actually you'd expect to see. But because they were doing so much of it, it felt amazing, and the staff were really enthusiastic. And so it's very easy to get caught along the actually, it's good practice, they're just doing loads of good practice, but actually there's nothing that's actually making it magic excellent. Do you know what I'm saying? And it's really easy to get caught away with that. And you know, you're very good, Gareth, at kind of rebalancing that and saying, right, can you just go back and, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had that experience myself as an assessor when I was, you know, writing one up, and actually I can't remember who it was who was reviewing the report that I'd written, but actually made me sit back and go, oh yeah, hang on, I've gone a bit far here, haven't I? But also it's worth acknowledging that if we've got a university that's got lots of good practice in all of its themes and nothing that we're concerned about, that probably is award level. You know, to get really lots of really good practice in 18 themes, that's a lot of work. Yes, we want to encourage them to go further than that, but that's not necessarily a bad performance overall. So we need to be aware of that too. Jo.
In the way that you just said, if it was co-produced and fully evaluated, etc., it'd be excellent practice, suggests that we need all of the elements to be excellent practice. And it's a bit misleading because I know that in the reports we've done so far, that's not the case.
No, yeah, sorry, I don't necessarily mean, I mean, those are examples of the kinds of things that would underpin. I don't mean all of them.
Yes.
I can't think of a single intervention delivered in the sector at the moment that would have all of those in place.
Yeah, I know. It's just the way that you said it.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. No. It's if it has some of those, one or that we would point towards some of that or one of those things as being why we think it's excellent practice. I think is the important thing. Okay. So let's just build on this. Just think about the conditions bit of all of this as well. And as I say, it's a bit of a challenge, this getting it right, because we have had experience of university colleagues getting upset when they get an award in progress. And they can feel that they can feel the conditions very personally, like it's a personal criticism of them, or that we haven't understood them in their approach because we haven't put into the award report why we're making that judgment. We haven't made it clear why we're making that judgment. Or they feel that we're telling them what to do in a way which doesn't fit their context and is too prescriptive, which generally isn't the case, but that's sometimes the interpretation they make. Or that they are too unclear, and there have been occasions where, and it's getting better and it happens much less now than it did in the early days, but where the conditions aren't clear, they're not sure what it is they're being asked to deliver overall. I would say, well, what we do find is when those conditions are well described and they're kindly written, so they recognize the effort the team have made, but they are still, however, being very clear about what needs to be done, that really does make a difference. So where it doesn't feel like it's personally critical or an attack on the university itself or on the staff who are delivering that service, it just simply identifies that there's an area where work still needs to be developed and that there's good work on which this can be built. That tends to be accepted and absorbed better, and people are able to work with it much more as a result. So last exercise with me, let's take an example. So let's say you're working with a small specialist university and they've got multiple data systems and there's data that seems to be getting lost. There's students who are being missed. There's stuff not adding up together. The university probably has constructive knowledge of some stuff, but because it's in lots of different data systems that don't talk to each other, it actually creates a problem. And staff are maybe having to do an awful lot of work to try and make sure that different data systems are connecting to each other, and that's creating stress for them. Let's create that as our scenario. And you think this is actually such a big issue that you think you want to set a condition around it. Let's take it that it's a real concern. How might you describe that to a university if you take that in place? So if you just take, again, 10 minutes in your groups, please, see if you can come up with a way in which you can describe that to a university as a condition, as something that you want to see them addressing prior to them getting an award. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool. Take 10 minutes. I'll add if you can put everyone into break rooms for 10 minutes, and then we will come back and hear your answers, and then we will hand you over to Fran. Thank you all. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully that was, again, another useful exercise. So the conversations have been really good so far. All the feedback from the groups has been really great. And thank you for all of your participation today and your involvement in all these conversations. It's been really rich and really valuable. Can I ask then for your feedback in terms of, did you manage to come up with a phrase or a way of phrasing this condition that made it clear what they need to do to improve? And that hopefully is done in a kind way that is also offering guidance. Does either group want to come up with that, or do you don't just want to feedback what how your conversation went? Don't mind either way.
We put a condition in the chat that we spoke about, and it talks about the systems using terminology such as review the capabilities of the systems, GDPR issues, review possible integration in order to flag risk across multiple areas dynamically across the required areas, impacts on students and staff, undertake internal audits to identify gaps, errors to inform effectiveness. So it was really about kind of pinpointing quite clearly areas, but using words that didn't feel aggressive at all. And that are focusing in specifically on where you think the gaps might be in those systems and why they might be a problem. Yeah. Okay, good. Anybody from the other group got anything alternative you wanted to share? Don't make me pick. Did we get to one in the other group, or was it just a conversation?
Yeah, it was more of a conversation. Okay. And spoke about examples and things that we'd seen. But we also discussed, in terms of conditionality, reviewing where they're at. So what systems they have, what data they collect, who has access to it, what it's used for, and how once sort of those risks have been explained in the sort of feedback sections of the report, that what considerations can they make to mitigate some of that risk while they can work sort of maybe longer term on addressing the issues. The university that I assessed last year, it was going to be quite a big investment for them to really redo their data systems in the way that they needed to. But what we really needed to know was that they were mitigating the risk. Yeah, very good. Very good. Okay, so that description, I think, is absolutely right. It's just that thing about being really specific about what is the risk we're seeing? Why do we think this is a problem? Why is it such a risk that we would actually want to set a condition around all of that? And then some guidance around, here are some, the university should take some steps to
address, mitigate risks immediately, as well as doing the long-term work that they're thinking about. And we can always add advice at the end of all of that as well. We can say some universities who have tackled similar problems have taken the following approaches. The university may wish to consider this when it's considering its options, so that it's being offered as an option to think about rather than an instruction. And I think if we do it in that way, it feels then that what we're doing is we're trying to provide guidance in a kind way that's also clearly saying, but this absolutely needs to be addressed for you to be able to move forward. Yeah, very good. All right, thank you all for all of that. That's really helpful. That's kind of the end of all of the bits that I'm covering today. So again, thank you all for your conversations and for all your contributions to everything that we've talked about today. Hopefully that's been helpful. And we will be running more training again towards the end of this year. And hopefully you'll see me again there. And in the meantime, as I see you along the way, thank you all very much for now. And we'll see you again in future. And I'll hand over to Fran.
Thank you, Gareth. Gareth, I don't know if you're hanging around to keep moving through the slides or, oh, thank you. Right, we are on the last session of the day. Do people just want to roll straight into it so that we can keep the time and finish? Yep, I can see one nod and I'm going with it. So thank you so much. It's been a really fascinating day so far, and this session will just helpfully wrap us up and just pull together some of the threads that we've been talking about. Your roles as assessors, the kind of expectations, how we operate efficiently and effectively. So we're going to change it up a little bit and just do one breakout session just to talk about a couple of key questions. But then I think we'll finish off by just doing everyone kind of 3-2 pen in. We'll utilise the chat panel and go for discussion, one just big group discussion. So if I can just move on. This last session, we want to create a code of conduct for assessors. We want to be able to create consistent policy and procedures, but we want it to be created by the group of assessors. Now, we started this in the in-person CPD day in November. So we have a draft. So what you guys will be doing is kind of feeding into the draft that's already started. I haven't got the draft with me here today. We'll take the notes from the kind of questions that we're asking. We need to be able to have a kind of common, consistent approach, and that need for development and learning to make sure that assessments are collaborative, as I say, and consistent and high quality. We need those assessments to be a rewarding experience for the universities, but also for you all. I appreciate that the reasons are kind of multiple about why different individuals become an assessor, but that opportunity to go in to see best practice, to see other institutions, how they operate, and to learn yourselves and have that opportunity to work with peers is really important. And so we want to just firm up, as we've been doing over the last 6 months or so, some of our processes, and this is part of the work. So this will be going in the assessor handbook that we're creating, because we appreciate at the moment, as assessors, you're using the award handbook that is written for the audience of the universities themselves. So we want to create something that's actually got a bit of that shift to you all. So if we go to the next slide. I think I said this at the beginning, but our assessors are really valued and are vital for the success of the award. We have this kind of ecosystem that we're growing through the University Mental Health Charter, and we're really thinking about how we talk about that and how we work with you all. We know that the collective experience within the assessed group, the knowledge that you bring and the experiences that you bring is really vital, and that we really need to tap into that. But also for the award process, as I say, we want it to be that rewarding and constructive and supportive. We want to make sure that universities going through the process all have a similar experience. We accept that they're not going to have the same. The circumstances at different institutions play out differently, but we need to be able to get your feedback to just help us create that. So the process that we will create off the back of a code of conduct needs to be fair and efficient. And in order to fulfill the expectations of the role, Student Minds needs to support you all to do so. So part of today's session and part of the session in November in particular was thinking about what the ongoing learning needs or areas for development or improvement that we can make to how we operate and how we support you all. And how do we continue to create spaces like today where we can come together, we can discuss key topics, we can really unpick some of the issues and help us all understand or see things differently. I think none of this will be new, but we wanted to make sure that we just recapped the role of the assessment team when it's kind of opening this session. So thinking about evaluating the self-assessment and all that supporting evidence, identifying additional information or evidence needed to support evaluations. I think of the couple of assessments that I've joined and been part of, that can vary. The quality of the information that's provided in that initial batch can vary, but hopefully we are moving to a point soon, and through some of the mandatory workshops that we are doing, where those kind of quality of the self-assessments and the evidence that's submitted continues to improve. But being able as the assessment team to identify those areas for exploration during the on-site visit, so to really think about those targeted questions that we've been talking today, and assessing the institution's whole university approach to the principles of good practice, and really being grounded in those principles, in those questions, the way that you're operating. And then finally producing that report, about sharing findings and making recommendations for the award outcome. And we know just how critical those reports are for the universities themselves, and to be able to use those as a kind of springboard to action planning, but also for us to be able to gather that insight and really think about what does this tell us about the sector as a whole when we do that thematic analysis. So what we'd like to do is to put all of this kind of role in the context of the Student Minds values, because in my opinion, everybody who's an assessor is part of the Student Minds family. And when assessment teams go out and undertake a site visit and are working with an institution, they're often referred to as the Student Minds assessors. You're not, whilst you're seen in almost like a dual role, you might be somebody from Leeds Beckett University, but you're also there on behalf of Student Minds, and the university, in particular those staff in the kind of wider panels and focus groups, will just see you as a representative of Student Minds. We really want to embody the values that we work towards as an organisation. So collaborative, empowering, innovative and courageous. And we really want to think about what does that mean in the context of the University Mental Health Charter, in the assessment process, and for the role of an assessor. So what we'd like to do, there's 2 final discussion points of the day, and I appreciate that everybody's kind of energy is at different levels, but we've got a few exploratory questions, as we would call them, to help us really just unpick the role of the assessor. So we'll do it again, breaking out into 2 rooms, and what we'll do is one group will take the first 2 questions and one group will take the second. So the first question, for you as an assessor and from the point of view of the university being assessed, what does a good assessor look like? And then the second question, referring back to the Student Minds values of collaboration, courageous, innovative and empowering, how does the role of an assessor relate to these? We had some really interesting feedback in November, so it'll be really interesting to compare kind of what you all feel. And then for the second group, what are the barriers for you as an assessor? What are the things that make being a good assessor, so to speak, challenging? And finally, how do you challenge one another? We're really conscious that within those teams, we need to create that safe space so that you are able to challenge one another, to ask questions about why you're going down that particular line of questioning, or what does this mean? What do you kind of, and particularly when you represent an area of expertise, and helping your other colleagues understand that or explaining that rationale. So we'll do about 10 minutes, I would say, just to have a bit of an unpick through these questions. So we'll come back at 2 minutes past 4 and just to get this feedback from the groups. So, oh gosh, should tell you which questions you're discussing. That would be an ideal scenario, wouldn't it? So I assume that they're referred to as breakout room 1 and breakout room 2. So if breakout room 1 takes the first 2 questions and breakout room 2 takes the second. Thank you, everybody. I just wondered if there were any particular comments that were shared or thoughts that the discussion provoked for any of you as a result of those questions. If not, that's okay. We took notes. It's towards the end of the day. I might move us on. Yeah, let's do the next question. So what we'd like to do is just pick your brains in this final discussion. And what I'm recommending is perhaps we do it as a full group. And please feel free to raise your hand, contribute verbally, but also if you just feel more comfortable adding things into the chat panel, we can keep an eye on that and respond. What should a code of conduct look like? So what kind of values, behaviours, responsibilities should we be considering in developing this code of conduct? And so that it's, as we say, it will be something that's stored within the assessor handbook. We will touch on it with all assessors and just how we all kind of play a collective role in upholding that code of conduct, but also we can share it with universities. And we really want to come from a place of being on the assessor's side. I just want to reiterate that. And it's about that kind of clarity of expectations with the institution and to be able to kind of challenge the university. So does anybody have any initial thoughts that they would like to throw in? Oh, we've got a few coming in on the chat, so thank you. Surprised you talked about a commitment to continuous improvement, Joe.
I'm not quite sure how I'd word this, but something around integrity has to be in here.
Mm.
I haven't got a full sentence for you. I'm tired.
It's the last session of the day.
Yeah, but definitely integrity needs to be in there.
I think particularly when just thinking about the discussions that we had in our breakout room, you'll put, hopefully not so much as we move forward, but you can be put into some quite challenging situations or where there's kind of tension in those panels, and being able to kind of operate in that manner. Anybody else want to throw anything in? Or Nicola?
Yeah, not an assessor, but lots of helpful chat just happened in the breakout room that I was in. And I've not been on this call all day, so I just thought I'd use my energy instead and save everyone else. People in the last breakout room that I was in were talking a lot about respecting the other assessors' areas of expertise and being open and willing to learn from each other as an assessment team, and kind of having that like respect other people's areas of expertise and learn from what they're saying, what their experiences are, from obviously quite different backgrounds. And I thought that was a really helpful reflection to have, as in terms of like working together as an assessment team and going on to those site visits, and like a nice approach when maybe you haven't met before and you're all coming from different perspectives. You've obviously got a student assessor as well, and like showing them the respect that they deserve as a student with lived experience of being a student as well. I thought that was a good point that I thought I would share with the rest of the group.
Thanks, Nicola. Hannah?
Yeah, I think Nicola kind of at the end there said what I was going to say, but just building on, I was previously a student assessor for the assessment I did, and the approach of the other two assessors in my team was really, really welcoming. And I think it's important to acknowledge that not all student assessors, some student assessors may well feel like there's a bit of a power dynamic entering into that assessment team. And so it's, for me anyway, it was really important that we like address that right at the beginning, and sort of then the clinical assessor and the strategy assessor were able to, I don't know, just be very, I don't know, felt like they really boosted me up and things like that, and were a bit more aware of it rather than shying away from what might be a bit of an awkward conversation around those dynamics.
And that's very important to have that safe space to be able to tackle that. And I think that leans into that kind of empowering value as well, of just how can you give somebody that confidence? Because I think I'm always amazed about our student assessors and how well they hold themselves in those panel interviews. And for some of them, if they kind of lead the VC like leadership panel as well, and having that confidence to do that and that support from the rest of the team, as you say, to feel that they are able to do that, not to slight any of our student assessors, but just I'm just always really kind of enamored with them. Joe?
I think we have a professional responsibility for knowing our own capacity and managing our own well-being, and that if we're taking on an assessment, that we've done that knowing that we've got full spare capacity.
Yeah.
And that we are looking after ourselves throughout that process and each other. So I think it's about responsibility for our own well-being and the well-being of the wider assessment team.
There's no mean feat when you agree to sign up to do an assessment. If you think just about that initial process of scouring through the self-assessment and the accompanying evidence, how many hours do you think that you take doing that? And then if you're asking for further feedback, you're preparing for the panels, it's a really significant undertaking. I think we're always acutely aware that people do this on top of your kind of regular job, and so that being able to juggle that and, you know, make, as Amanda said, as we move into that cohort model as well, the deadlines are fixed. We don't really have much give. I think for some of our earlier assessments, we were able to kind of shuffle and to get a bit of wiggle room, but we just won't have that with kind of panels being fixed. So I think we will really rely on assessors to be kind of, it's your call whether you've got the capacity to do so. Anybody else?
Just to add, because we've discussed it quite at length actually in some of the groups, and we all come with mixed expertise, and we bring our own perspective and views. So it's important to, and just speaking on what I think Joe was saying about integrity, is about being fair without bias or any personal agenda.
I think it's really interesting because one of the questions that we posed at the in-person day, where we were able to have kind of more questions out to the group, was around the kind of lines of how do you not get drawn into a personal area of interest or research or expertise in a disproportionate way, and acknowledging that things may kind of take your fancy, but how do you do that in a balanced way so that you'll remain grounded in the principles of best practice? So do we have any final thoughts? I'm really conscious that you guys have been online for a lot of today. Joe?
Just following on from what you're saying there, and there's something about, I think about being courageous is holding each other to account and supporting each other. So if we feel that one of us are going down some rabbit hole, is acknowledging that, you know, and kind of challenging it in a obviously a supportive way.
And it is so easy. Something you hear something that is like relates to some work that you're doing yourself, or it sounds particularly interesting. Without realizing, you can end up asking a few more questions, and then by the time you've kind of checked, it's like 15 minutes has gone over an hour panel session. And those panels, you look at you start it, you think, how are we going to fill an hour? But actually, they fly by. Or the ones that I've been in, particularly when you're note taking, so you don't look up from the screen. So we'll just move on to next steps. What I will say is that please continue to add anything to the chat panel, or if you have a think about this, particularly with it being that last session and something just pops up, do just drop us a line, because we're just working, as I say, on that iteratively, and these notes will be fed into that first draft that we created from the November session. So we'll be collating all the session notes, we'll collate any feedback from everybody, and we'll use that, as I say, to feed into that code of conduct. If Emily was here, I would ask her about the time frame for the assessor handbook, but I'm really sorry, I'm not as familiar with when we're hoping to get that out. So unless one of my colleagues can jump in, I'll just say it's a priority that we're working on and kind of focusing on at the moment. If we can just shuffle through a couple of slides. Thank you. And again. So I'll just move us into wrapping up. We said we finished about 4:30, 4:15 feels like we're fairly on time, and particularly after quite a lot of screen time. So just a huge thank you, first of all. Thank you to everyone for your attention and participating. Online is quite a skill to be able to stay engaged and kind of merge between breakout rooms and the kind of volume of information that we share. As I say, if you do have any feedback, if there's anything that comes up that you just kind of comes to you as you like over the next couple of days, please do drop us a line. We will do some email follow-up with everybody and just ask for some feedback about today so that we can continue to improve
particularly in an online environment, we're always really conscious about have we got the balance right between information and breaks and breakout rooms. So please do continue any conversations on the hub. I know Amanda referenced the Assessor Hub at the beginning of the day, so please do check that out if you've not utilised it yet, and look out for regular Assessor newsletters. And we a final couple of notes. So we have student recruitment coming up soon. We're just finalising the details of that. We know that we need to expand the number of student assessors that we have, and obviously students naturally age out. So we will be sharing that opportunity with the Assessor Network, just to see if you can share it within your networks and encourage people to apply. And we have various events coming up through the programme. So our next in-person practice sharing is in London in a couple of weeks' time in February, and we have a leadership event in April. So if you aren't as familiar with some of the in-person events that we've got coming up, please do familiarise. A final plug, she's not here, but I was going to say a quick thank you. Obviously, thank you to Gareth for leading a lot of today and really being a kind of steady hand, and Amanda and all my other colleagues who've been note-taking and supporting with the tech. And Emily, because for those of you who may or may not be aware, Emily Van Vliet is leaving us in about a month's time. So we are recruiting at the moment for a replacement for her, but she will be hard to replace as she's made such an impact working with the team over the last year or so. But thank you so much for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you on assessments or in other activities or events.